That's insane, Lloyd called out to Javier, did you even hear me? Javier replied, huh? What? Lloyd suddenly remembered that he forgot to remind him to cover his ears. Javier asked again, what did you just say? Lloyd pointed his finger at Javier, you're such a bad guy. Javier squinted and said, am I worse than you? Lloyd yelled, did you hear that? Javier asked again, what did you say? Thanks to Bio, the cement problem was finally solved. Lloyd happily said, in the world of construction, speed is key. Let's get started. The first thing to do was to make and put on a super large diaper for Bio to filter the volcanic ash. A 5-layer filter net was installed behind the diaper to filter the volcanic ash. Then, Lloyd asked Bio to use the skill charge energy to prepare for eruption. A deafening fart sound exploded. Everyone at the scene covered their ears, and the crowd watching the spectacle was also shocked by the scene. Lloyd immediately shouted, Bio. Do it again. The Count observed and thought, this is beyond ordinary construction level, with skills he had never heard of before, including summoning skills. He must see how Lloyd handles this issue and then report it in detail to the king. If Lloyd really is as talented as the rumors say, keeping him in the countryside would be such a waste. After collecting the cement materials, the second step is to make a mold to pour the cement into. Once completed, transport it by boat and place it at the designated location. The water in the mold can be sucked dry by Hippo in one gulp. The third step, Javier will hammer in the piling. As a knight, Javier can drive the pile deep into the ground with just one strike. Javier has already driven the friction pile into the rock at the bottom of the sea. After finishing, Javier turned and asked, when do we start the next pile? Lloyd told him to wait a moment, saying it would be difficult to do. Then Lloyd showed a proud smile. Javier saw this expression and asked, what are you smiling about? Lloyd laughed and said, I just wanted to hear Javier complain, I'm a knight, why do I have to? He stopped halfway through and just smiled at Javier. Seeing Lloyd like this, Javier became a little irritated. He swung the hammer away, turned, and tried to walk off. I'm a knight, why do I have to hammer piles? Lloyd immediately said, Javier is the knight in charge of escorting me. If Javier doesn't hammer the piles, we won't make any money. That means we won't be able to pay off the land debt. If I get anxious, the Baron will be sad too. If the Baron falls, the Baroness will get sick, right? Sir Knight, please protect our family. Sir Knight, please. Javier was already very annoyed listening to Lloyd. But he could only hold back his frustration and continue hammering the piles. After reinforcing the foundation, the construction of the internal steel frame began. Finally, pour the prepared cement into it. After the cement hardens, remove the mold. In the end, the artificial sea foundation was successfully completed. Lloyd told the Baron that this artificial foundation is 50 centimeters higher than the sea level. When the tide comes in, if a mermaid statue is placed there, it will float on the water. The Count looked at the artificial foundation and said, to be honest, I still can't believe this land can support the weight of the statue. If it succeeds, then he won't be disappointed by the construction costs. Lloyd stood silently, just slightly bowing and smiling. On a night at sea, a statue was erected on the artificial foundation, surrounded by 5 brightly lit ships approaching. The statue was encrusted with many precious jewels, making it sparkle and dazzlingly beautiful. There were many people on the ships holding a grand feast. Lloyd felt uncomfortable because his collar was too tight. Lloyd asked Javier, do you wear this kind of clothes regularly? Javier replied, Lloyd makes it sound like it's my first time wearing this. I remember you've worn it a few times for events. Hearing Javier's words, Lloyd responded, no, it's just been a long time since I wore it. But he thought to himself, this guy is really sharp. Suddenly, the Count loudly said, everyone, look over here. This young man is the biggest contributor to the construction of the mermaid statue, and he did an outstanding job. Upon hearing the Count's words, everyone gasped in admiration. But awkwardly, everyone ran to Javier's side, saying, you are truly amazing. Your appearance and skills are flawless. Can we shake hands? Just once. Lloyd simply sighed and thought, I really am smart, of course, I knew everyone would go over there. He wasn't jealous, he was someone who valued money over praise. But seeing Javier's expression was really irritating. Get away, don't look at me, I don't want to empathize at all. At this moment, the Count walked over, laughing, and said, "It's all because of your face, Loy." Hearing this, Loy immediately felt displeased, thinking, this guy is so annoying. The Count patted Loy's shoulder and loudly said, "Everyone, this is the real person who built the artificial foundation." Hearing this, everyone was shocked, and someone said, "Huh? I thought it was a servant." The banquet continued cheerfully. But in the distance, a giant figure began to appear. A wave surged up to the surface of the sea. Giga Titan appeared. It gazed at the sparkling mermaid statue. Giga Titan looked at the statue and thought, mermaids are sworn enemies. Then it began to slowly dive. It swam towards the statue and began to sprint, thinking, he is acting alone, kill him. Titan was rushing towards the statue at an astonishing speed. The people on the ships were still immersed in joy, completely unaware that danger was approaching. Giga Titan was getting closer and closer to the statue. Javier held his wine glass and walked to the edge of the ship, sitting down alone to drink. Just as he was about to take a sip, he suddenly sensed something was wrong. He swept his eyes over the sea, wondering what was happening. But the sea surface was empty, there was nothing. Loy walked out and asked Javier, "What are you doing? Why are you suddenly sitting still, like a statue?" Seeing Javier silent, Loy sarcastically said, "But that doesn't mean you look as handsome as a statue, don't pretend to be deaf and mute." Javier said, "Something is approaching." Hearing Javier say this, Loy also looked out at the sea. But unfortunately, Giga Titan was diving deep underwater, with no signs at all. Loy asked, "What exactly is it?" Javier replied, "I'm not sure, but it's moving very fast." Loy then asked, "How big is it? Tell me its size." Javier responded, "It's about twice the size of this ship, slightly bigger than the full size of Hippo." Hearing Javier's answer, Loy was startled and cursed, "Damn it." Lloyd walked up to the Count, who turned around and asked him how he felt about the banquet. Loy whispered to the Count, "It seems like a Giga Titan is approaching, you need to notify everyone and evacuate immediately." The Count immediately called for his personal guard, Genova. He asked Genova if he sensed any unusual movement in the distant sea. Genova began sensing the sea surface in the distance. Then, he reported to the Count that he didn't detect anything unusual. The Count said to Loy, "Genova's sensory abilities are extraordinary. He awakened special perception due to Sword Master Syndrome, so you can rest assured." Loy rolled his eyes and thought, Javier is much sharper than this guy. "Do you think you're the main character? You think this little reason will convince me?" The Count smiled and said, "Don't worry too much. In the past few years, a Giga Titan has never swum this far, there's no reason for it to suddenly launch an attack." Hearing this, Loy suddenly realized something. Before the conversation was finished, both of them looked toward the mermaid statue at the same time. The Count's expression turned serious. Javier and Loy had already confirmed it, it's it. Genova, standing aside, spoke up, "I don't know what's making you uneasy, but based on my perception." Before he could finish, the Count suddenly stretched out his hand and shouted, "Lift the anchor. Move the ship away from the mermaid statue." Just at that moment, Giga Titan suddenly surfaced. The sailors heard the command and immediately started pulling up the anchor. Javier stood behind and said, "It's too late." Lloyd immediately shouted, "Javier, cut the anchor chain." Javier immediately jumped off the ship and rushed into the sea. Lloyd threw Ppo Diong out and shouted, "Help that person." Ppo Diong immediately ate a red sunflower seed. Then, he jumped out and grabbed the statue. Javier dived into the water and struck the anchor chain. He began using his magical power. Then he unleashed a powerful strike and cut the anchor chain. Ppo Diong also bit through the ship's rope. The ship started drifting once the anchor chain was severed. Javier continued underwater, cutting the anchor chains of other ships. He glanced back. At that moment, the giant titan rushed toward them. Javier was also startled by its speed. The people on the anchored ship screamed and fled in all directions. Just then, the giant titan surged up from the seabed. Its impact flipped the entire ship, causing Lloyd and the people on the ship to scatter into the air. Ppo Deong stood on the statue, staring in horror at the giant titan. The giant titan struck fiercely, shattering the statue into pieces. At that moment, Javier shot up from the seabed. He immediately flew over and grabbed Lloyd. The statue was shattered by the giant titan's attack, and part of it flew toward the city. It then crashed heavily in the middle of the street, causing panic among the people nearby. The statue cracked into several fragments, scattering in all directions. Then, it smashed into a house. Many people are drowning in the sea, loudly calling for help. Lloyd stood on the overturned ship and said, "We can't save everyone." But he suddenly thought of something and immediately summoned the hippopotamus. He pointed at the sea and told the hippopotamus to jump in and start sucking up water. A current was sweeping people off the sea, and the hippopotamus was sucking water, pulling them into its mouth. The giant titan had already climbed ashore. Wherever it went, the houses were destroyed. Javier saw the giant titan entering the city and shouted loudly, "Master! A giant titan is speeding toward the city, we must stop it." He turned around just in time to see Loy sitting on a piece of wood, planning to paddle away. Javier widened his eyes and shouted, "Loy! Where are you going?" "The giant titan is in the opposite direction." Loy turned around and shouted, "Why get involved in this? Javier actually wants to fight that monster, has he gone mad?" Hearing Loy's words, Javier was momentarily stunned, unable to believe it. Meanwhile, the Count was shouting loudly, "Hurry! The pressure from the water flow is too dangerous. Rescue people as quickly as possible. We can't delay even a second, or everyone will be swept away by the current." People in the water screamed desperately, "Help! We're here!" The giant titan had already advanced deep into the city. Its destructive power was terrifying, and the residents in the city were terrified, desperately fleeing for their lives. Back to Loy, he was asking, "Javier, what are you doing? Come over here." Javier shouted, "Are you going to abandon the people who need help?" Loy immediately shouted, "We're here to make money, not to fight monsters or maintain peace. The city has an army and cannons, even without you, they can handle it." Upon hearing this, Javier's eyes instantly filled with anger. He thought to himself, "Loy Frontella." In life and death situations, Loy always shows his wisdom and determination not to give up easily. He never backs down in the face of difficulty, this is the true Loy. But as Javier was thinking, Loy urged him, "Forget about it. Why do you want to protect other people's city? Let's go, this is not the time to be a hero." Javier simply looked at Loy in silence, thinking to himself, so this is Loy's true nature. System prompt, Javier's affection for you decreased by 5 points, empathy increased by 1 point. Relationship with the protagonist slightly decreased, but RP value unaffected. Current RP value, 1901. Javier drew his sword and said, "I will take care of this." Hearing Javier's words, Loy shouted, "You maniac! You'll die, don't go." Javier didn't care at all about what Loy said, he jumped onto the sword. Then he fell into the water. He released his burst of power and moved across the surface of the water. Javier raced across the sea's surface, as fast as the wind. On the city side, soldiers on the tower had already wheeled out the cannons, and the commander ordered everyone prepare. As the giant titan approached, a round of cannonballs was fired. But unfortunately, the cannonballs were like mosquitoes stinging stainless steel. A soldier saw this and screamed in panic, "This thing is completely undamaged?" The monster roared. The armor on its head cracked, revealing a hole. The monster began to gather energy. 2 water columns shot out from that hole. Upon making contact with the lookout tower, it instantly destroyed it. The monster's eyes were blood red, roaring with a thirst for slaughter. In the distance, half of the statue was blasted off and fell to the ground. The statue had shattered into many pieces. The monster roared, "Mermaid, kill it." Then it charged forward. Wherever it went, houses were destroyed, and the residents below were terrified, screaming and calling to each other to flee. One person fell while running. Above them, a giant titan's foot suddenly stomped down. Just then, Javier suddenly appeared from the sky. He immediately used his strongest move, Explosive Slash. The sword struck the giant titan's foot, causing it to step back, narrowly saving that person. However, when Javier's attack hit the monster's outer armor, it was deflected, and he was stunned, thinking, this is completely useless. The attacked giant titan staggered, crashing down onto a building. It shouted angrily, "Kill it." Javier stood below, raising his sword in defense. The giant titan used its massive pincers. It thrust forcefully towards Javier, instantly smashing the rocky ground into splinters. Luckily, Javier quickly dodged. But unexpectedly, a stream of water shot out from the crack on the giant titan's head. Javier barely dodged and, turning back, saw the air pressure closing in on him. He quickly raised his sword to block in front of him, thinking, this is it. The blow hit Javier with tremendous force. It sent him flying, crashing into the wall. He then fell heavily to the ground. This blow severely injured Javier. The giant titan moved closer, staring intensely at Javier. Seeing it approach, Javier thought, all right, I've fallen into a trap. I know I can never defeat this monster. Maybe I'll die here. But I'll do my best, until everyone escapes. Meanwhile, Loy was paddling the wooden board, preparing to escape. As he paddled, he murmured to himself, I've already said it, it's not just Javier who's the main character in this novel. No matter how much RP I have, it can only be used to enhance my construction skills. What can I do? What can I do? What happens if I leave? I'm human too, seeing the city being destroyed, seeing people hurt, what is Javier's point? What can I do? While paddling, Loy suddenly stopped and began to think. If I just run away, the city will be destroyed. If I let it be destroyed, then who will pay for the reconstruction? Loy shouted, go back, Bio. Bio quickly grew huge, using the power of a volcanic eruption to speed across the surface of the water. Loy stood on Bio, shouting, just wait, you damn giant shrimp. Back towards the city, Javier and the giant titan were engaged in a fierce battle. It lunged forward with its foot, but Javier cleverly avoided it. He accelerated with explosive force, successfully dodging the attack while leaping upward and thinking. Which creature has no weakness? The weakness is in the eyes. Javier thrust his sword toward its eye, but it was unharmed, with only sparks flying from the friction of the attack. It retaliated with its tentacles. Before Javier could react, the giant titan's tentacle hit him, and there was no way to dodge while in midair. Just as it seemed hopeless, a huge roar was heard. A massive sphere flew from the sky. It slammed into the giant titan's face. It forced its head down, face to the ground. Then the sphere bounced back. It turned out to be a hippopotamus. After striking, the hippopotamus expelled all the water from its body, causing it to shrink. It then landed on Loy's head. Loy coldly looked at it and said in a cold voice, don't touch my money. Loy stood on the roof, watching the fallen giant titan. Javier raised his sword, preparing to strike, thinking. At that moment, he started using his explosive sword technique. But the sword strike hit the giant titan's shell and was immediately bounced off. Javier gritted his teeth and cursed, damn, it didn't work. The giant titan stood up, glaring fiercely at Javier. Javier stared at it, thinking that he couldn't find its weakness, and he felt that he could not win this battle. But why did he feel so relieved? Maybe it's because Loy is here, Loy has returned, and this will open the path to victory. 2 minutes and 30 seconds ago, Loy was riding on Pipiodong, running towards the direction of return. Pipiodong jumped over rooftops, moving closer to the standing giant titan. Loy shouted from its back, take a detour, don't get too close, don't let the monster notice us. Pipiodong ran in a circle, and Loy observed. Loy looked at the giant titan, thinking, weakness, I must find its weakness. Over there, Javier was attacking the giant titan frantically. From here to there, he kept swinging his sword. Roy observed that Javier's attack had no effect on the monster. What is this monster made of, and how is it so powerful? Roy suddenly realized that if that thing could be. He immediately activated the measurement skill. A beam of green light started to appear on the giant titan's body. Soon, its entire body was covered in green light, and the parameters were displayed. At this moment, Roy happily thought, it works, I can measure living things. The thickness of that horn is 1 meter, and Ki is mixed inside. From the molecular structure, there are 3 layers of honeycomb-like structures interwoven. All the structures are tightly connected, like wearing a bulletproof vest. Javier was now shouting frantically, die. He raised his sword and unleashed his power to charge at the monster. One strike aimed at the giant titan. Roy stood outside observing Javier's attack, looking at this strike and thinking, what is that? Javier's attack focused its damage on one point, exactly that part. That horn gathered energy and released it. First, let's cut off the horn. Roy activated simulation mode, thinking, that's where the monster stores moisture, used for attacks. Can it be destroyed? After reviewing the simulation, Roy calculated that this plan was entirely feasible. He could defeat this damned monster. Javier attacked for a while, felt it was ineffective, and then turned to Roy asking, what should I do now? Roy clasped his hands together. Then he made a horizontal cutting gesture with one hand. Javier didn't understand what Roy was doing and shouted, are you crazy? Roy heard Javier's words and was so angry he nearly exploded. He pointed at the horn on the monster's head and said, horn, Dad, cut off the horn first, old man. At that moment, the giant titan's tentacles attacked. Javier immediately jumped to avoid the monster's attack. While dodging, Javier thought, just cutting off the horn won't work. But since Roy said it, hopefully, this time it will work. Javier quickly ran on the giant Giga's body. Roy urgently shouted from outside, Javier, listen carefully. Even if the horn is hollow, it's not easy to cut off, and the energy ring won't necessarily succeed every time. While charging towards the horn, Javier asked, then what do you want me to do, Roy? Roy shouted, sometimes, you just need to spin at maximum speed. Javier jumped and swung his sword, saying, it's really useful, easy to say, hard to do. Then he swung his sword fiercely at Giga's horn. Every thread of magical energy appeared and then exploded. Javier's sword emitted a dazzling green light. Roy, seeing this from outside, clenched his fists and thought happily, all right, the magic chainsaw, although this is just your theory, it really looks effective. Now, it was incredibly easy for Javier. Giga howled in pain when the horn was cut. It immediately struck at Javier's horn area with its pincers. Roy commanded Bobodong to charge forward. Giga's pincers were knocked away by Bobodong's body. Javier had already deeply cut into Giga's horn. In the end, Javier finally severed its horn. Giga howled in pain after its horn was cut off. Its horn fell, smashing several buildings. Roy, seeing the horn cut off, raised his hand and shouted, Javier, go to the center where its 2 legs meet and cut toward the direction of its tail's horn. If you cut in this direction. After hearing this, Javier quickly rushed to the bottom of Giga and turned to prepare for the attack. As Javier raised his sword to prepare for the attack. Suddenly, Giga's entire body fell, trying to crush Javier underneath. Javier wasn't ready, his eyes widened, panicking as he looked. Giga's entire body fell, smashing the ground with stones and dust. Javier's sword was also knocked away. Roy, seeing this scene, widened his eyes in disbelief and shouted loudly, Javier. A few seconds ago, when Giga was about to fall and crush Javier, Javier was preparing to attack underneath. When Giga was about to fall and crush him, he didn't run away but instead made a desperate attempt to perish together with it. Javier gritted his teeth and thought, die, monster. At that moment, Bobodong suddenly appeared, rushing like an arrow. He rushed up, bit Javier, and pulled him away. He pulled Javier out just in time, preventing Giga from falling on top of him. Once outside, Bobodong immediately turned around, squinting his eyes, staring at Giga. Roy saw that Bobodong had saved Javier, and happily clenched his fists, shouting, well done, Bobodong. Bobodong waved his foot, as if saying, Javier, why are you so reckless? Luckily, I arrived just in time, or you might be sitting watching a naked chicken eating unpeeled bananas, and drinking beer without needing to open the bottle cap. Javier, hearing the mouse's voice nearby, didn't understand what Bobodong was saying and replied, sorry, I don't understand what he's saying either. Javier walked over to pick up his sword, saying, well, maybe he's scolding me. After all, I was too reckless. Then, let's just try to survive until we destroy this monster. Javier trusted Roy's plan. Roy stood outside, frowning and thinking. Thanks to successfully measuring, he had developed Plan D. But executing this plan was very difficult because Giga Titan was too agile. But the plan had to be carried out no matter what, as it was the only way to destroy this damned monster. This is the A+D plan. Roy immediately shouted, Bobo Dong. It immediately jumped back and joined Roy. Roy shouted to Bobo Dong, go to the location I mentioned earlier. Bobo Dong called out, seemingly understanding. Roy, riding Bobo Dong, shouted loudly to Javier, that monster sees you as its strongest enemy, so lead it to the forest on the east side of the city. Javier responded loudly, got it. Roy, riding Bobo Dong, ran ahead while thinking, we've already wasted enough time, I think we can do it now. Please. Roy could only hope for this to work. 15 minutes ago, Duke Bartle was on the ship, watching Giga's back as it walked into the city. His eyes were filled with despair, and he said, I can't believe this is happening. At that moment, Genoa walked over, lowered his head, and said, I'm sorry, Duke, I wish I had known earlier. The Duke could only weakly hold his head and say, this isn't Genoa's fault, it's my naivety. I thought a small statue would be enough to destroy a monster. At that moment, Roy appeared and loudly said, no, he's right, Giga is chasing that statue. The Duke, seeing Roy, asked, are you still alive? Roy said, that monster came because of the statue. We can use this obsession to carry out the plan. Javier and Roy will buy time for him, while he needs to do something with his family members. Back to the present, Javier was running hard to escape Giga's relentless pursuit. It struck heavily with its pincers, but fortunately, Javier jumped aside to avoid it. After dodging, Javier turned around and cursed, damn it. He stood in front of Giga, panting heavily. Javier felt his body was reaching its limit. He gritted his teeth and thought about something. Then he turned around and ran, thinking to himself, give it my all, for the city, for the people. When Giga saw Javier running away, it became even more furious, screaming as it chased after him. Although Javier was already exhausted, he couldn't stop. He pushed himself to run faster. As Javier rushed towards the forest, Roy shouted from behind. Javier was almost at the statue. Hearing Roy's shout, Javier looked ahead in surprise. Suddenly, a vehicle appeared, which also caught Giga's attention. The repaired mermaid statue was tied up with ropes. Roy's mouth curled into a bright smile. Javier widened his eyes and said, what is that? A wooden cart was being pulled by Bobo Dong, carrying the repaired statue. The shaking cart made the statue's head and hands sway. Roy stood on the cart and shouted, you bastard lobster, do you know who your father is? Your real enemy is here. As soon as Giga saw the mermaid statue, it immediately lost its composure. It opened its mouth and roared loudly. Roy smiled as he watched this scene and thought, this bastard took the bait. They had repaired the statue even better than Roy had hoped. He believed their preparation was truly worthwhile, and he was glad he had read the novel. Roy shouted loudly, Javier, I'll be the decoy, you attack. Javier ran while saying, next time, make sure to explain the plan in detail first. Roy, riding Bobo Dong, sped past and said, this kind of thing will never happen again. Pu Dong started to turn around as he approached Gigan. He had to tighten his butt muscles and run faster to avoid being caught by Gigan, or else both he and Loy would have frozen legs. Loy, sitting on the cart, shouted loudly, oh no. When the target turned toward Loy, Javier seized the opportunity to counterattack. He quickly rushed forward, jumping high, aiming to strike its abdomen. Javier gritted his teeth and focused his strength. He launched a powerful critical strike. The attack hit Gigan's abdomen with force. It triggered a massive explosion, engulfing its abdomen. Loy, running ahead, heard the explosion and glanced back. The attack caused Gigan to momentarily pause. After the attack, Javier was in freefall, but he kept his eyes on the sky above. Gigan's abdomen had been torn open, creating a large hole. Looking at the wound, Javier thought, damn, it was too shallow. He had already used too much magic. No, this is just an excuse. Is it because I'm too weak? I'm not strong enough to protect everyone. At that moment, a voice rang out, Javier, you've done very well. Loi, riding Pudong, came back and shouted loudly. Leave the rest to me. After the critical strike, Javier's energy was depleted, and his consciousness began to blur. But he felt like he could rest now. At that moment, Loi's figure quickly rushed up, shouting, leave it to me. By now, Javier was unconscious, but only one question echoed in his mind, Lord Loi, why did you say that? Suddenly, a spherical object quickly flew over. It was Hippo, who came to catch the unconscious Javier. Lloyd shouted, rest, Javier. This city must be protected. But in reality, Lloyd was thinking to himself. As he ran, he shouted, I actually don't think we can do it. How could he lure Gigan so far away and destroy it? There was no guarantee it wouldn't return to the city. The waters below Cremo were surely Gigan Titan's habitat. And it's intelligent. It could trigger stronger earthquakes to retaliate because the mermaid was summoned. No, wait, Padang has reached its limit and can't hold on any longer. Lloyd shouted, Padang, now. Padang immediately slammed on the brakes with its feet. Then it used its hind legs to forcefully launch Lloyd into the air. As Lloyd flew, he thought, what can I do now? What's the most important thing? What can I do? Back when Lloyd was riding Belle, he had decided to save the city and quickly made a decision. The plan involved parts where he needed to participate in the attack. Lloyd thought, critical strike. There's no other way, I have to use the critical strike. 3 circles are needed to use the critical strike, but right now Lloyd only has 2 circles. Lloyd shouted, open the skill window. He wanted to upgrade to a level 3 circle. The system displayed, Azrahan Heart, level 4 circle 2, upgrade requires 190 RP, with 1901 RP available. Seeing this, Lloyd thought, I need 190 RP? Too expensive. But it's the only option now. It's decided, quickly. Lloyd immediately chose to upgrade. After upgrading, the system displayed, Azrahan Heart, level 5 circle 2, upgrade requires 220 RP. Huh? 220? Each upgrade increases by 30 RP? It's getting more expensive. System, give me a discount. Lloyd frantically pointed at the screen, upgrading to level 6, 7, and then 8. But suddenly, Lloyd stared blankly at the system screen. Azrahan Heart, level 10 circle 2, upgrade requires 370 RP. RP available, 311. Lloyd's points were already exhausted and not enough. Lloyd gritted his teeth and cursed, damn. This can't be happening. It seems he didn't plan to participate in the battle. Back in the present, Lloyd was holding on to Gigan's abdomen, thinking, how did I end up hanging here? On the other side, Javier was already unconscious. Lloyd bit the shovel in his mouth tightly, thinking, should I just inject all the mana and stab it? A slight wound will do. On the other side, Javier, unconscious, was thinking about some things. Suddenly, the system displayed, Javier's affection towards you has increased by 4. Your affection increased by 5. While Lloyd was holding on to Gigan, he accidentally glanced at the system display, Azrahan Heart, level 10 circle 2, upgrade requires 370 RP, RP available, 391. Seeing the requirement met, Lloyd immediately upgraded to level 3 circle. The system displayed, congratulations, Azrahan Heart has been upgraded. Starting from the 2 surrounding circles, the third light beam began to appear. 3 circles were already rotating around the heart. The system displayed, Azrahan Heart, level 1 circle 3, mana increased by 500%. Lloyd, holding the shovel, shouted, search. He thought, a circle to protect the heart, the remaining 2 circles. While Lloyd was still thinking, Giga stepped on the mountain rock below. Its step shattered the rock, sending stones flying in all directions. Lloyd shouted, unleashing his power, and the blade of the shovel became scorching hot, aiming for Giga's abdomen. But at that moment, a rock flew towards him at high speed. It struck Lloyd's head violently, causing him to be instantly dazed. He let go of his grip on Giga. Lloyd thought to himself, he couldn't do it. He needed to carve a circle, a mana circle for the heart. What? The remaining circles, what are you doing? The circle. These circles, wait a moment. The 3 light circles gathered together and merged. At that moment, Lloyd turned, pulling the flames from the shovel, creating a long trail of fire. Then he leaped and thrust upwards, shouting, "Heavenly critical strike!" Just as Lloyd's attack was about to make contact with Giga's abdomen, a blinding light flashed. A deafening explosion echoed. At that moment, Giga collapsed, causing the mountains and the forest below to be instantly destroyed. The citizens of Cremo City turned around to look at the forest behind them, seeing a column of smoke rising into the sky. Giga was now still, with no movement at all. Under the moonlight, the dust slowly dissipated. A few pairs of eyes spotted the 3 little ones, Podong, Hippo, and Belle. Javier had just regained consciousness. Javier struggled to sit up and said, "Everyone is safe now." Javier suddenly noticed something to the side. Seeing the huge Giga lying quietly beside him, he said, "Really? Did Lloyd take responsibility for what he said? How could this possibly succeed?" Podong cried as it grabbed Javier's hand. Javier looked at it, as if asking if it wanted him to follow. The 3 little ones, with worried expressions, led Javier along. When they arrived, Javier saw Lloyd lying motionless. Javier's eyes widened, seemingly unable to believe what he was seeing. Lloyd lay there, unconscious with his eyes wide open, still bleeding from his head where he had been struck by a rock earlier. Javier rushed over and shouted, "No! Young master! Lloyd!" Javier immediately sat down, placing his head on Lloyd's chest to check his condition. At this moment, Javier became even more panicked, Lloyd's heartbeat. It has stopped. The scene shifted to another place, where a pigeon was flying in the sky. Its direction was towards the Frontera estate. The Baron was sitting in his room when he heard a knock on the door. The pigeon outside stood seriously, like an officer, delivering the letter. The Baron took the letter and discovered that it was sent from Cremo City, but he didn't know what it was about yet. After reading the contents, the Baron's expression became stiff and somewhat panicked. He hurriedly jumped on his horse, preparing to leave. In the cold winter, he rode his horse at full speed, with only Lloyd's name in his mind. The Baron's face was filled with panic as he kept reminding himself of the risks Lloyd faced in danger. Suddenly, his wife appeared and said, "Wait a moment, why are you leaving so suddenly?" The Baron explained that despite his constant hurry, the journey was still long, so he could only go with Lord Byron. The Baron's wife asked what he was talking about, had he forgotten? She was a better rider than him. After a brief conversation between the 3, they continued to ride at full speed. The letter sent to the Baron contained, "Dear Baron Frontera, your eldest son Lloyd Frontera has successfully completed an extraordinary project for Cremo, but now Cremo is in danger." At that time, Lloyd Frontera and his guard Javier Oswarin courageously sacrificed themselves to save countless civilians. Currently, Lloyd Frontera is in a strange state of unconsciousness. I believe you need to know this as soon as possible, so I am sending you this letter. I will wait to meet with the parents of this remarkable young man. The Baron, on the way, was filled with worry, thinking, "Lloyd, this troublesome child, but he is my son. He is the most diligent and trustworthy. My son, my son." He recalled the conversation he had with Lloyd earlier. "I have already consulted with Baron. Don't worry, my lord. This will be done. I express my deepest gratitude, my lord." At this moment, he was also thinking, "Is he really my son?" Suddenly, a terrifying foot appeared on the cold white snow. The 3 of them all looked ahead, their faces full of worry. A terrifying monster, looking like a dog, was glaring at them. The monster roared, scaring the horses into a panic. Byron jumped off his horse, raised his sword to block in front of the 2, and said, "We took the shortcut, there's no escape." He would buy time for them. "Quick, find another way to Cremo." The Baron urgently urged, "Mr. Byron, let's escape." Byron replied, "These beasts are very fast. The moment you turn around, they will pounce and bite off your neck." The monster seemed to have lost patience, opened its mouth, roared, and charged toward them. Byron shouted at that moment, "Hurry!" At that time, the monster's huge paw swung toward them. Byron raised his sword and barely blocked the blow. The Baron turned his head and said, "Forgive us, Byron, we will meet again in Cremo." The monster continued swinging its paw, attempting another attack. Byron also raised his sword, preparing to counterattack. He swung his sword forcefully, just as the monster's paw was about to strike. But suddenly, half of the sword broke off and flew out. Byron's previous strike had caused his sword to snap into two pieces. The monster seized the opportunity, leaped forward, and bit down on Byron's shoulder. He immediately drew a short sword from his waist. One strike pierced into the monster's mouth. However, the strike had no effect on the monster. It pinned Byron to the ground. Byron tightly gripped the short sword, struggling to kill it. But the power gap was too large. The monster's teeth sank deep into Byron's shoulder, and blood splattered. Byron screamed in pain at that moment. Suddenly, the Baron appeared, charging forward with a sword in hand. He jumped forward and pierced the monster's body with one strike. The female Baroness also rushed forward, holding a short sword. She thrust the sword into the monster's eye. After being struck in the eye, the monster released Byron, howling in pain. It struggled on the ground, and after a while, it no longer had the strength to do anything. The three of them, still in shock, stood there staring at the monster's corpse. The Baron hurriedly stepped forward to help Byron up and asked, "Can you stand?" Byron said he was deeply ashamed of himself, wondering how he, as a knight, could end up like this. Before he could finish, the Baron quickly interrupted him, saying, "You are also my lord. As a lord, you have a responsibility to protect your people." At this moment, the Lady Baroness hurriedly called out the Baron's name. He turned around and asked, "Are you hurt?" But when he looked behind, his eyes were filled with fear. A group of monsters was approaching them. Byron, struggling, managed to walk toward the corpse of the slain monster. He pulled his sword out of the monster's body. Despite being injured, he still firmly held his sword, pointing it at the group of monsters. The group of monsters did not hesitate, opening their mouths and charging forward. Byron's gaze was resolute, determined to fight these monsters to the death. The Baron and his wife were now filled with despair, holding each other tightly. At the brink of life and death, the handsome young man Javier appeared. He kneeled, assuming a combat stance, ready to draw his sword. The group of monsters suddenly sensed a threat from another direction and turned to look. Javier simply swung his sword once and decapitated one of the monsters. From then on, every step he took was accompanied by flashing sword lights, and one monster after another was slain. After sheathing his sword, Javier spoke. "Just in case, I came to assist you. Are any of you injured?" Byron looked at Javier in surprise. He knew Javier was skilled in both swordsmanship and magic, but he wasn't strong enough to be at this level before coming to Cremo. What made Javier so strong? After dealing with the monsters, Javier walked up to the three of them. The Lady Baroness asked with concern, "Dear Javier, Lloyd, is our Lloyd all right?" Hearing this question, Javier's eyes filled with sadness as he silently pondered. Javier said he wasn't sure if Lloyd was still alive. Recalling the moment when the Giga Titan was defeated, Javier stood beside, panicked, seemingly unable to believe what was happening before his eyes. A single voice was screaming in his mind, "No. If Lloyd disappears now, then our family's legacy." Javier took Lloyd's hand. He felt nothing but pain and despair, thinking about the hometown he had just seen. Javier could only lower his head, quietly standing beside Lloyd. Suddenly, Javier realized something. He noticed that Lloyd's pulse was still beating, but his heart had stopped. Despite being weak, Lloyd was still breathing. What should I do? Javier hurriedly checked Lloyd's condition. But this only surprised Javier even more. What is this? Third-tier ring? And they're spinning at an incredible speed. Javier couldn't see the condition of Lloyd's heart. Due to the magnetic interference, he couldn't check. This powerful magic rotation has replaced the heart's position, sustaining Lloyd's life. Chain critical hits. Now he finally understood why that giant titan had turned out that way. "Lloyd, who exactly are you?" The scene shifts to the port city of Cremo. The city's residents were busy repairing and cleaning up the ruins caused by the Giga Titan. The Baron and his group had arrived at Cremo. Javier said that Lloyd was at the Count's mansion, being looked after by doctors. But the situation hadn't changed much. The Baron looked around at the destroyed scene and said, "This is terrifying. Was it only Lloyd and Javier who fought that monster and destroyed all of this?" Javier said it wasn't like that. Lloyd was the one wielding the sword. It was Lloyd's power that ended that monster. Upon hearing Javier's words, the Count and his wife thought to themselves, "Lloyd, my son, actually possesses such power?" Suddenly, two people walked over and asked each other, "Are you going to the Count's mansion?" "Of course. Since I can't do anything, isn't it supposed to be my job to do this?" Lloyd Frontera. "Without him, I might have already frozen to death out there. When we approached that monster, I don't know how many people he saved. I thought I was going to die, unable to move. I gave up, waiting for death." When Lloyd returned to the city, he had belly-eat all the ruins. That way, the residents wouldn't get hurt. A few women were discussing, "I think the spark got stuck in the statue's fragments. If we continue to leave it, everything will fall into flames." "You saw it too, right?" A huge hippopotamus appeared during the construction. It absorbed the water and put out the fire. "Yes, I saw it too." "Was Lloyd the one who summoned it?" "In this city. I don't know how many people owe him their lives." At the Count's mansion, many people had gathered. Everyone had the same thought, "I hope the one who saved our father, our wife, our mother, the savior of everyone, has awakened." Suddenly, someone in the crowd behind shouted, "Are you crazy?" A man with a nose like it had been punched shouted loudly. If Lloyd hadn't built the base for that statue, none of this would have happened. Looking back, it's all Lloyd's fault. Some of the people standing there were stunned. Then they began to discuss. But soon, he was beaten up by a few people for daring to say such things. At this moment, Lloyd's heart erupted with light. The system displayed a message: "Your sacrifice and courage have left a deep impression on the citizens of Cremo. Achievements come with tempting rewards. To learn more, click here." Lloyd suddenly woke up at this moment. He groggily opened his eyes. He sat up, feeling a sharp pain in his head. He whispered to himself, "I remember I dared to use chain critical hits. Am I still alive?" The system sent a message, "Maybe." "How could you be dreaming if you were dead?" Lloyd quickly asked, "How is that possible? Wasn't my heart explosion part of the setting?" The system sent a message, "You'll understand slowly. Shouldn't you check something more important?" At this moment, Javier opened the door and walked in. Seeing that Lloyd had woken up, he was also surprised. Lloyd saw Javier walk over and immediately called out that he came just in time. The first thing the young man asked was, "When will the Count's mansion pay the construction costs?" Javier froze upon hearing this question. Damn, he had just almost died, and now he wakes up only caring about money. What a greedy guy. Javier smiled when he saw Lloyd wake up. It seemed that Lloyd was fine. Suddenly, two voices calling Lloyd came from outside. The Baron and his wife had arrived. The two rushed up and tightly embraced Lloyd. As they cried, they said, "Lloyd, you're safe. This troublesome kid, that's great. Lloyd, do you know how worried I was?" Thinking to themselves, "Is this our Lloyd?" But it doesn't matter. Thank God, the child is alive. The scene shifts to Royal Magenta Avenue. Someone was reporting the situation. It says here that the Giga Titan has been defeated. It will not return. This is the last word from the Count of Cremo Castle. After saying that, someone upstairs let out a soft "oh" and said, "How interesting. There are people like him in our country. Send a message to the Frontera estate, inviting him and his knights here." The person below immediately bowed and said, "Yes, Your Majesty." The person above was a red-haired woman, resting her chin on one hand and holding a sword in the other, saying, "Whether that letter is true or not, I will go see him personally and make a decision." She was Queen Alicia Termina Magentano. The scene shifts to Lloyd. He felt a bit frustrated, Suddenly the system displayed a message. Your courage and determination have become a living legend spread across the nation. Due to increased social prestige, you have received an additional RP reward. RP reward 1500. After seeing the reward, the young man became excited as if he had drunk an energy drink. The system displayed another message, reading skill information. Mental magic skill, stores large amounts of magic power in the heart. After reading the information, Lloyd touched himself and thought, no wonder I'm still full of energy even though I was unconscious for a month. He had become a user of mental magic. This means digging will be much easier. The system helplessly sent a message, is that all you can think of? Lloyd said, oh. Are you looking down on the workers across the country? The system apologized, please forgive me. The system continued to send notifications. Your mental magic was not formed through conventional training but through shockwaves. For this reason, your mental magic has unique properties. Lloyd was stunned when he read the message, not understanding what it meant. The system notified him, skill exclusive choice, shock compensation. Even without special protection, it can still compensate for the impact caused by explosions. Lloyd stared at the message, thinking, what does this mean? Does that mean I can use chain critical hits at any time? This means the digging speed will be faster. The system, knowing Lloyd's thoughts, couldn't help but shout, oh my god, can you use the skill for something cooler? Lloyd casually said, what's more honorable than being a laborer? Are you looking down on digging work now? The system apologized helplessly again. The reason mental magic needs protection from explosive shockwaves is because the magical mind is like a container of power. Activating an explosion means that the nearby gunpowder barrel will also explode. This is a hidden danger, and if you can't protect it, you will immediately reunite with your ancestors. But at that moment, Lloyd did not have mental magic. Thanks to this, he was able to keep his life. A shockwave exploded in Lloyd's heart, transforming into mental magic energy while trying to preserve his life. Lloyd sighed and thought. While cultivating mental magic, he had neglected it, thinking that one more attempt would be beneficial. Sometimes laziness can bring benefits. At this moment, Count Cremo opened the carriage door and entered, saying, sorry to keep you waiting. Let's go. Lloyd turned and said, all right, goat. Suddenly, Lloyd's gaze became sharp. He licked his lips, showing a meaningful smile. The carriage began to move. Lloyd sat in a daze, looking out the window. He suddenly spoke, how much will the repair costs for that estate and road be? The Count told him that it might exceed a month's budget. Lloyd coldly said, if that giant titan hadn't died, I guess it would have cost more than a year's budget. The Count was stunned upon hearing Lloyd's words. Then he began to sweat and frowned, saying, what do you mean, Lloyd? Lloyd placed his hands on his knees and softly said, it's nothing. Compared to a year's budget, the construction fee I received doesn't even cover pocket money. Haha, thinking about it, ha ha ha. My god, who would have thought that the statue made to defeat that giant titan would cause such trouble? Listening to Lloyd's words, the Count's face had completely darkened. Lloyd continued, maybe we can blame someone? This is fate. People did lose their lives because of this, but, fortunately, everything went smoothly. Oh, now that I think about it, hearing my family's summary, those who worked hard for the city's benefit, regardless of their status, will definitely receive financial compensation. He curiously asked, I wonder how much the public cares about this? At this moment, the Count hurriedly said, 1.5 times. But Lloyd remained silent. The Count squinted and asked, is that enough? Lloyd calmly said, oh, sorry. Maybe I gave you the wrong impression. I'm not asking for extra compensation. But now I know. Lloyd said more sarcastically, for him, the value of the people's lives is just 1.5 times the construction cost. Hearing this, the Count began to sweat on his back. The Count thought for a moment and said, then double it. Lloyd coldly looked out the window without saying anything. The Count finally confirmed again, triple it. Hearing the Count's words, a crazy smile appeared on Lloyd's face. This time, you're done for. Seeing Lloyd still silent, the Count hesitated, wanting to raise the price again. Suddenly, Lloyd reached out to him, and the Count didn't understand what was happening for a moment. Lloyd gave an angelic, pure smile and said, "I'm impressed by the Count's contribution. I will treat it as compensation for a good cause." The Count shook hands and said, "Okay, okay." But thought to himself, "This is strange. I'm sure I've just been blackmailed." But he didn't dislike Lloyd. How could he? Why didn't he feel uncomfortable at all? Outside, the crowd began to gather. Someone shouted, "That's the Count's carriage. It's Lord Lloyd. He's here. Long live Lloyd." Sitting in the carriage, seeing everyone outside welcoming him, Lloyd thought, "I was nothing but a useless person back in Korea." Suddenly, he felt a great deal of pressure. The Count told Lloyd that the audience seats had magical sound equipment prepared. All the residents were eager to be here, waiting for his speech. Lloyd squinted and thought, should we heroes, after going through disaster together, say some cliché lines? No, after all, I didn't make money through enthusiasm. When Lloyd and a few others walked onto the podium, the residents below had already excitedly shouted Lloyd's name. Lloyd stood above, squinting as he looked at the crowd below. He placed his hand on the sphere, thinking, how many people are here, I wonder? The entire square was waiting for Lloyd's speech. Lloyd thought, if I could make some money from the people here, that would be great. Lloyd pointed and said, "Hello, everyone. Have you heard of underfloor heating?" The crowd was surprised by his opening words. From the Count to Javier, to all the residents, everyone was stunned for a moment. Lloyd looked up at the left. Then he turned to the right. Seeing no one speak, he touched his face and said, "Oh, it seems everyone doesn't know." Next was an advertisement, elderly people, joint pain in winter. Parents worried their children might catch a cold. How much time have you all spent battling with your heaters? An hour? 2 hours? If you're 50, you've already wasted 15 years of your life. If you feel that's a waste, think about the underfloor heating system. It can greatly improve everyone's quality of life. Lloyd raised his hand and finished speaking, then realized something was off. So, he looked down and checked again. Then he shouted, "No. This still needs to be improved. Ahem, for more detailed information, please visit the Frontera Count's estate." That's all. After finishing the promotion, he turned and left, leaving everyone nearby surprised. The Count watched Lloyd's back, thinking to himself. He now understood why he couldn't dislike Lloyd. Lloyd carefully managed his profits. He was stubborn, but still acceptable. And, Lloyd did what needed to be done. Rather than dislike him, the Count thought about bringing Lloyd under his command. Keeping someone like Lloyd in this village was truly a waste. After everything was finished, everyone returned. Frontera Manor would become Lloyd's cash cow. And this senior knight, Lord Byron, was kind, honest, responsible, and everything was good. However, compared to his efforts, his knight skills were only at an average level. No, they were even below average. Lloyd felt this was truly unfortunate. Lloyd was standing in the room, stunned, unable to speak. Byron was reporting to Lloyd, "The preparations for the event have been completed. The list and information for land allocation are in this folder. We've decided to address the complaints about the lack of labor from farmers, as well as the input issues with oak workers and coal miners, and supplement the workforce. We've also signed a large supply contract for the underfloor heating system with neighboring estates, with a 30% discount. The net profit margin is only around 10%. But since then, we've found that the returns from coal sales have ultimately led to a net profit of over 50%. Next are the issues regarding moisture insulation and repairs." Before Byron could finish, Lloyd interrupted, "Byron, wait a second. Did you arrange everything while I was away?" Byron was a bit stunned when he heard Lloyd's question, not understanding what Lloyd was saying. He answered that he had just followed Lloyd's instructions and also took on some additional tasks. Suddenly, a soldier entered to report that the underground system floor had finally been completed and requested an inspection. Byron turned and said, "All right, thank him. He'll come in about 30 minutes." The scene switched to the construction site. Lloyd and Byron arrived to inspect. Byron carefully checked every detail of the construction quality. After the inspection, Byron stood up and smiled, saying, "They completed it flawlessly, I'm impressed." The soldiers who were praised by Byron smiled, feeling very happy. Byron reminded them, "Remember, my usual nagging is all for this moment. Now, you are important members of this team." Lloyd stood beside him, watching everything Byron did, and couldn't help but widen his eyes and thought, "He really has skill. He's incredibly proficient. Uncle, you were born in the wrong era. If this were in Korea, he would definitely be the CEO of some big company. Bonuses. I should give him a generous reward." The system displayed a notification. The flooring system for Frontera Manor has been completed. This underfloor heating system will become part of the Frontera style, forever etched in the history of the continent. Based on the significant construction achievement, a large RP reward will be paid. Contribution reward 400 RP. It turned out that the series of underfloor heating system contracts were the Baroness and Baron's accomplishment. They didn't have an inheritance, but they had another kind of ability. It was like being born under the protection of the goddess of fortune. With the strength of the new generation, many people would be both amused and bewildered. On a new day, the sky was blue and the clouds were white, and two young men, Lloyd and Javier, walked toward a construction site. Javier looked up and said he guessed that a large warehouse like this might be needed to store coal. Lloyd replied, "Of course, because the output will be countless." Lloyd was thinking. With the payment for construction, he had already paid off more than half of his debt, along with many water bills from the residential areas. Thinking about the future, Lloyd's face showed a smug smile, a disgusting grin. He thought to himself, soon, he would live a carefree life, reaping the rewards without working, without worrying about making a living. Javier, seeing Lloyd like this, thought to himself every time he saw this, it made him feel disgusted. He really wanted to slap him. Suddenly, the sound of a horn was heard outside. Both of them were puzzled and turned to look outside. Lloyd asked, "What's going on? What's that sound?" Javier told him it was the first time he had heard it, but he knew it was the royal messenger's horn signaling their arrival. A team of carriages was already heading toward the manor. After hearing Javier's words, Lloyd furrowed his brow and asked, "Why would the royal messenger come here?" A red carpet was rolled out outside. A man wearing a green outfit that looked like banana leaves, with an odd style, jumped off his horse. His dismounting posture resembled that of some Korean singers. He then stood up and pulled out and swung a rolled-up edict. He then held it in his hand. He let go of the edict. After completing a series of strange actions, the two people behind him clapped madly to cheer him on. At this point, Lloyd and the Baroness were already kneeling on the ground. Lloyd gritted his teeth and thought to himself, "Why is this clown dragging on so long? Just finish it already. I'm going to die from these weird games." The messenger began loudly reading the edict. Since ancient times, great emperors have fought for the peace and prosperity of the nobles, citizens, and all people. Not only that, but they also comfort the people, blah blah blah. Hearing the messenger read a few lines, Lloyd thought to himself, could it be Cremo? Was this something Cremo did? The messenger continued, "In light of this revelation, the Queen has ordered that the two brave heroes who defeated the giant Titan should meet her in person and be rewarded for their heroic deeds." The system displayed a notification. The Baron's interest increased by 9 points. You received 90 RP. Upon hearing the edict, the Baron began crying like rain, excitedly saying, "It is an honor, Your Majesty. It is a great honor. I am proud of my son." Lloyd, over here, was gritting his teeth and sweating, thinking to himself. He was very grateful for the extra RP, but this wasn't a good thing. He had once struggled terribly in the military, just barely managing to avoid causing trouble. If he did better than required, that was unacceptable. If he broke that strict rule. Lloyd recalled his time in Korea. A fat man squinted and pointed, saying, "Hey, Sergeant Kim. I heard you used to work in the civil engineering department, right? Go install a heating system there." Hearing the fat man's words, he replied, "The civil engineering department doesn't do the construction themselves." The fat man asked, "What? You don't want to do it?" He immediately answered, "No, I'll do it." He made a big mistake. He worked too hard. He did it too perfectly. Then came the praise and new orders. So you're Sergeant Kim? You seem smart, build a nice garden house. Is it possible? What's wrong with the village dam? Sergeant Kim, why isn't the camp secure? Hey, Sergeant Kim, the mountain over there is ruining the view here. Hey, Sergeant Kim, right? Send a telegram there. If he got involved with the king, he would have to say goodbye to his easy country noble life. At this point, the messenger had read the final part of the order. This is an order. Lloyd Frontera and his guards are to immediately proceed to the Royal Avenue. After hearing the order, Lloyd was in tears, thinking to himself that he should have ended it after laying the foundation at the bottom of the sea. That damn lobster cursed him. What should he do? If he was chosen by the emperor, he would be seen as an easily manipulated person for life. Should he play dumb? No, that would be too dangerous. If he was seen as a fool, he might lose his head. Shortly after, the escort team set off. Lloyd sat in the carriage, expressionless, as though soulfully lost. Javier, seeing Lloyd's expression, said, "Look at Lloyd, he looks like he's just been sentenced to death." Lloyd nodded, saying Javier had a sharp eye. Javier said, "I didn't expect this." If it were Lloyd, Javier thought he would be happy and thinking about how to make some money from the king. Lloyd hadn't regained his composure yet, and when he heard Javier's words, he was deep in thought. He had intelligence on Queen Magentano and her future. The situation with the Royal Avenue. If he used this information, he should be able to find a way. Javier was right if things really turned out this way. Then, completely suppress it and resist the Royal Avenue. Soon, the two young men, Lloyd and Javier, arrived at the palace and knelt down. A voice echoed, "Lloyd Frontera and Javier Azarhan, rise." Both of them looked up at the front. There, the queen stood with a sword, her face cold and stern. Lloyd sweated and smiled, thinking, I'm suddenly a bit scared. She's not joking. Lloyd quickly spoke, I greet the queen, Lloyd Frontera, to meet the master of the Royal Avenue. The queen frowned upon hearing Lloyd's words and asked, You? She thought the person next to Lloyd was the noble. Lloyd fell silent upon hearing this, thinking to himself, why does everyone say that? Is there something wrong with my face? The queen smiled at him and said, Are you Javier Azarhan? She felt a unique magical energy flowing through Javier's body, and he seemed to have the ability to contend with her. Javier lowered his head and said, Forgive me, I am just a guard. Lloyd thought to himself, she only recognized Javier's uniqueness. As expected, one of the kingdom's two greatest swordsmen, pretending to be foolish and acting recklessly, could not fool this queen. The queen continued, saying that she had heard of their achievements from Count Cremo and praised their courage and spirit of sacrifice. But she would not judge a person based solely on someone else's introduction. Only by seeing it with her own eyes would she believe it. Lloyd looked up at her, thinking to himself, just as I thought. The queen continued, saying that she would personally assess Lloyd's abilities. Upon hearing this, Lloyd smiled, thinking, here it comes. The peak moment. A once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A golden chance to win the queen's contract. The queen asked, in today's age and in the environment we find ourselves in, what is the most urgent construction project needed on the Royal Road, Magenta? Lloyd knelt below, thinking after hearing the question, so, it starts with a riddle? The most urgent construction project she mentioned is. Of course, he knew. Because he had the entire outline of the novel. The queen narrowed her eyes, scrutinizing Lloyd, thinking to herself, if Lloyd really has talent, he should be able to spot the problem immediately. If he lacks even this level of observation, he won't be acceptable. The two of them looked at each other, the same thought appearing in both of their minds. The most urgent project on Magenta is. Conservatism in the kingdom is on the decline. Lloyd then spoke, the Magina River crosses the Royal Road, a bridge should be built to span this river. The queen frowned slightly upon hearing Lloyd's answer. Lloyd lowered his head and thought, thinking, I guess the queen will be somewhat dissatisfied with this answer because it isn't the one she wanted to hear. But with her personality, this matter will certainly not end here. strong, absolute power, along with fairness and equality. She would listen to everyone's opinions without bias. At this point, the Queen asked, "What is the reason?" Lloyd answered, "Some may think so, but what is truly needed is conservatism." Upon hearing Lloyd's answer, the Queen furrowed her brows and showed a surprised expression. Lloyd continued, "A long time ago, as I know, an evil dragon destroyed the top of a tower twice. To prevent the same thing from happening again, the roof was transformed into the flat and wide shape it is today, still maintaining the fear that the entire roof could be destroyed. Now, the Magenta Kingdom has become unusually heavy because of this. Therefore, this weight presses on the foundation and pillars, causing them to bear an increasingly greater burden. However, the need for conservatism will arise again at some point in the future, so I don't think this is the most urgent problem right now." After listening to Lloyd's series of analyses, the Queen frowned, thinking to herself, "This guy is really arrogant." Though she already had an answer, Lloyd had given a completely different response. Lloyd smiled, thinking to himself, "The Queen must also understand that I deliberately answered a different question, even though I know the correct answer." The Queen thought to herself, "He knows, I know." Even though the answer is in his mind, Lloyd will still give a completely different response. Lloyd thought, "I know the Queen knows I know, and the Queen knows, even though the Queen already has the answer in her mind, I will still give a completely different response." The system, seeing Lloyd's thoughts, couldn't help but send a message of lament, "Stop it, this madman." At this moment, the Queen and Lloyd engaged in a battle of wits. She, like a fierce beast, ignited with anger. "Does Lloyd mean he wants to play with me?" Lloyd instantly transformed into a well-behaved little dog. "How dare I? I just came to beg for food, only food. Construction orders. Construction funds." Lloyd spoke, "The bridge on the Magina River has been rebuilt 12 times. It cannot withstand the impact of faster spring currents, and it collapses at specific times. Every collapse severely affects the lives of the people and requires huge funds for repairs. This bridge must be built due to natural conditions. If Your Majesty allows us to construct it, we will build a bridge that will not collapse under spring floods or ice block impacts." Lloyd was referring to a modern suspension bridge. After hearing Lloyd's words, the Queen pondered, "Is he questioning my judgment? Why does someone as arrogant and casual as him make me like him more the more I listen?" The Queen said, "Describe in detail the bridge you intend to build." Hearing the Queen's words, Lloyd smiled slyly, "Thank you, Your Majesty." But in his mind, he thought, "Wonderful. I knew she would like it." Flatterers are hated, but those who are confident and stick to their beliefs will earn endless trust. Lloyd began to explain enthusiastically, "I want to build a suspension bridge, suitable for large span areas. The construction method is, build high towers on both sides and use steel cables and anchors to secure both ends of the bridge, the steel cables." Hearing Lloyd's flood of unfamiliar knowledge, the Queen suddenly raised her hand to interrupt. "Stop, enough. I suddenly don't want to hear it." Lloyd recalled the events in the novel. This was Queen Magentano. However, she would later be betrayed by her closest people, lose an arm, and eventually become a ruthless ruler. But that was a story 3 years from now. For now, she was still a wise ruler willing to listen to even the most humble of people. The Queen asked, "What if the bridge collapses?" Lloyd thought, "Then I'll pack up and run." But he firmly said, "Your Majesty may cut off my head at any time." Lloyd raised his head and stared at the Queen, "But if the bridge stands strong, I ask Your Majesty to ensure the position of my family." Hearing Lloyd's words, the Queen couldn't help but smile slightly, thinking, "He actually made me laugh." She raised her hand, signaling, "You may proceed." She allowed Lloyd to do as he pleased and promised him generous rewards, along with the guarantee of his position. Lloyd, upon hearing this, immediately rushed to the stairs where the Queen was standing, making her somewhat confused. Lloyd handed her a rolled-up document, and the Queen asked, "What is this?" Lloyd replied, "It's a contract. Please sign it, Your Majesty." After hearing Lloyd's words, the Queen frowned and said somewhat displeased, "You mean you don't trust my promise?" But in her mind, she thought, "This guy, he actually wrote a contract in advance? Really?" Lloyd immediately explained, "No, Your Majesty. The contract also includes that if I don't do my utmost to build this bridge, I will face severe punishment. Please see it as a necessary constraint for an untrustworthy and humble person. After hearing Lloyd's explanation, the Queen narrowed her eyes slightly, feeling that this deal was a bit suspicious, strangely unsettling. While signing the contract, the Queen thought, this is strange, I know this is Lloyd's trap, yet I'm not angry at all. This guy has deceived his way up from the bottom to the top, and now even I've been tricked, truly the king of deception, the master of boasting, the god of words, the master of psychological manipulation, the guide of reason, the destroyer of faith. After receiving the contract sealed with the Queen's stamp, Lloyd bowed deeply and smiled, saying, I am greatly honored, Your Majesty. The Queen frowned and asked, what's with this strange posture? Lloyd replied, I can't let my head be lower than Your Majesty's signature, so I bent lower. The Queen was speechless. I get it, but hurry up and stop that ridiculous posture, I don't want to see it again. After everything was settled, they were escorted out of the hall. Suddenly, Lloyd kicked his foot and began dancing, performing various fancy dance steps in turn. Lloyd took out the contract, pointed at it, meaning, see this? I tricked the Queen. The contract is here. Javier tilted his head and glanced over, meaning, Lloyd, speaking so rudely like that, it's easy to lose your head. You can't stop a swordsman's sword, so don't be too reckless. The scene cuts back to the palace. The Queen's guard said, Your Majesty, Lloyd is very clever and calculates extremely quickly. The Queen replied, do you think so too? Lloyd is even more impressive than I thought. The guard asked, Your Majesty, are you dissatisfied with Lloyd? The Queen answered, I am not dissatisfied at all, because Lloyd has thought from the very beginning that he has already won against me. But Lloyd does these things so naturally, even, somewhat charming. A few days later, Lloyd carried a big bag, seemingly going somewhere. Javier walked over and asked, is it okay for you to go out alone? Lloyd replied, why would I need a guard in such a peaceful kingdom? Lloyd frowned and said, besides, you know, it's a hassle to go out with you. Even just filling out the survey earlier, with you here, I couldn't concentrate at all. Wherever I went, a crowd of girls surrounded me, even birds were trying to court me. And me? I looked like a servant. Lloyd was about to leave when Javier said, please give Julian my best wishes. Lloyd waved his hand, got it, got it. Julian Frontera is Lloyd's younger brother, currently studying at the Royal Academy. Before heading to Royal Avenue, the Baron had prepared many winter clothes and blankets for him. Lloyd thought on the road, now that I think about it, what happened at this time in the novel? During this period of the year, the Baron's family had become so poor that they couldn't afford tuition, which caused Julian to be kicked out of the dormitory. In the end, he encountered robbers while wandering at night and was killed. Lloyd smiled and thought, but now, none of these things will happen. I saved a person, don't I look cool? Then let's go see my little brother, whom I don't even recognize his face. After a while, he arrived at the Royal Academy of Magenta Kingdom. Lloyd stood at the door, staring ahead. A young boy stared at him and said, what are you doing here? Lloyd didn't speak, only thought to himself, I know he's the same age as Javier, but this kid is so small, look at that face. How terrible was the original owner of this body, for my brother to look at me like this. If I act friendly but not too enthusiastic, he shouldn't suspect anything, right? Lloyd threw the bag to Julian and said, take it, Mom sent it to you. Julian frowned and thought, didn't he always call me the rude little brat? And now, he specially made this trip to bring me something? The system issued a warning, favorability too high, the other party is starting to suspect whether you are Lloyd himself. Seeing the system's warning, Lloyd was startled, what did I just do? Ah, damn it, Lloyd, you idiot. He couldn't be bothered to think anymore, turned around and left, saying, I'm leaving, little brat. Julian watched his back, thinking, he really didn't leave a single curse word and just walked away like that. The system displayed a warning, due to overly human-like behavior, suspicion was rapidly increasing. Seeing this warning, Lloyd became a bit irritated, what does this mean? Do I need to punch this kid in the face? Just as he was thinking this, he suddenly remembered. Before coming here, the Baroness had said, could you have dinner with Julian? That boy is very lonely. Thinking about these troublesome matters, Lloyd frowned and rubbed his head. He turned and said, "Hey, little brat, are there any expensive restaurants around here?" Julian asked, "Yes, but why are you asking this?" Lloyd replied, "Why am I asking?" "Of course, to buy you something to eat, little brat." Julian frowned, "Why are you buying me food?" Lloyd said impatiently, "Why?" "Because Mom asked me to, you little brat." Soon, the two arrived at a fancy restaurant. Lloyd crossed his arms and watched as Julian looked at the menu. Julian said he would order a regular set. Upon hearing this, Lloyd immediately said, "Order something expensive. You don't get to come to fancy places like this often." The two stared at each other, neither saying a word. Lloyd called out, "Hey, little brat." Julian thought to himself, "Forget it. I chose this dish because it's the only one I know." Julian added a special set to his order, muttering to himself, "What's his problem? This guy curses at me all the time and even kicked me earlier because I looked at him." Lloyd called the waiter over and ordered 2 special sets. The waiter looked at Lloyd and said, "Sir, you seem like a foreign guest, would you like some wine?" Lloyd answered, "No, I quit drinking, just this." Julian thought, "What? The guy who used to drink himself into a stupor and live how he wanted is now quitting drinking?" A few days ago, a guest suddenly visited the castle and spoke about the Titan giant attacking the commercial city of Cremo. And the person who defeated the Titan giant was named Lloyd Frontera. Lloyd didn't believe this story at all. Lloyd Frontera? That guy didn't have the brains or ability to do something like that. This is obviously nonsense. The one who made the achievement was clearly Javier. I always thought it was strange. It's too absurd. He's completely changed. Just then, while Julian was eating, a blonde man suddenly slapped him hard on the head. Lloyd, eating his meal, looked up, not understanding what was happening. The blonde man glared at him and said, "What are you doing eating here?" Julian, frightened, stammered, Sorry, something happened today." The blonde man asked, "Something happened? What happened?" After saying this, he punched Julian hard again. "What did you learn in law class?" He continued punching and kicking, shouting, "Don't understand the law? You think you can change the rules with your ideas?" Lloyd, seeing Julian being beaten, had already put down his knife and fork. The blonde man kept hitting and cursing. A baron shouldn't be eating in such a conspicuous place. Why? It's just annoying to look at. Lloyd listened to the man's insults and didn't act immediately, only coldly glancing to the side. At the table next to them, 2 people saw Julian being beaten and even showed a contemptuous smile. The blonde man continued humiliating Julian. "I don't want a beggar in the family. What do you think you can accomplish? Poor fool. What does your family's land even have? Oh, right, just those lowly country bumpkins, those dirty sharecroppers." The entire restaurant remained silent, with no one standing up to stop the blonde man. Lloyd sat there thinking, "That's right. The Academy magazine said that family status is more important than degrees, right? What's even more ironic is that a poor, country boy can get close to the royal family. What should Lloyd do? If he helps Julian, that guy's future campus life will only become harder." Julian also gave a hint, telling Lloyd not to get involved. But, looking at the bruises all over Julian's hands, the blonde man sneered and said, "Our family, the Lacona family, is recognized by the kingdom. This is the only qualification to sit here and eat." Upon hearing this, Lloyd was surprised and looked up. "Lacona? Viscount Lacona?" Lloyd clasped his hands together, seemingly calculating something crazily in his head. A brilliant smile suddenly bloomed on his face. This expression, surely someone was about to have a very bad time. The blonde man was about to continue attacking but heard a voice from behind. "What's your father's name?" The speaker was Lloyd. The guy stared and sneered, saying, "My father? He is the wise and kind Viscount Lacona. Who are you? Is he your relative? Mind your own business, get out." Just as he said get, Lloyd slapped him, distorting his mouth. The slap was so forceful that it sent his 2 front teeth flying. Then, he slammed him hard onto the ground, causing him to roll several times. He was knocked to the center of the room, sliding across the floor like a rag, finally crashing into the wall. The entire floor was wiped clean by him. Lloyd stood there thinking, the cooldown time for cheap magic attack skills is 0 seconds. A system message came, you can act so cool even without using any skills? The blonde man's friend saw his companion get beaten up and immediately stood up, pointing at Lloyd and shouting, this mad dog. How dare you lay hands on a member of the Upper Alliance? Before he finished speaking, Lloyd turned around and slapped him again, distorting his mouth and knocking out a tooth. At that moment, a strong man jumped out and shouted, I'm the #1 Platinum Fist King of the 2nd year. Prepare to die today. Before he could finish, he was also slapped by Lloyd, losing a tooth and an extra service fee. Then, 2 more people stepped forward and shouted, who are you? This arrogant bastard. What do you think you are? Seeing them step forward, someone yelled, go. Those are the famous Black Dragon twin horns, the Count twins. If they team up, that guy won't even have a skeleton left. Lloyd calmly crossed his arms. Then, just as the twins appeared, Lloyd knocked them to the ground with one move. Next, Lloyd walked toward a guy who was trembling with fear and coldly said, who was the one talking about horns just now? Was it you? The person stammered in fear, what? No. I. Before he could finish speaking, his mouth was once again slapped out of shape. Seeing everyone at the table being slapped away one after another, the 2 people who were eating turned pale in fear, watching Lloyd walk toward them. One of them stammered, we didn't say anything. Lloyd merely looked at them coldly and said, you laughed. After saying that, he swung both his hands and slapped each of them once. At this moment, the blonde man suddenly lunged at Lloyd, shouting, die. Bastard. Lloyd had just turned around when he was hit hard by a punch. The guy, seeing his fist land, laughed excitedly, how about that? A magic punch from a genius mage? But soon, his smile would disappear, replaced only by regret. Diego Lacona, 21 years old, the young man already regretted it. Lloyd's nose started bleeding. He showed a mad smile, like a demon, congratulations, you hit the jackpot. Lloyd grabbed Diego Lacona by the collar, with a cruel smile on his face. Then, he slammed his forehead into Diego's forehead. Diego immediately went limp and fell, but Lloyd still firmly held onto his collar, not letting go. He lifted Diego up again, and Diego, terrified, shouted, please stop. But what responded to him was another brutal headbutt. Julian, standing to the side, was stunned, thinking in fear, this bastard Lloyd is really crazy. At first, he was just a little insane, now he's completely mad. I was naive enough to think he was a normal person. Julian suddenly turned his head, frantically thinking, where are the staff? They were just here, where are they? Meanwhile, Lloyd had grabbed Diego's head and pressed him against the wall. He stared at Diego and said softly, now you're completely confused about what's happening, aren't you? Why I'm beating you like this? You have no idea, right? What did you just say? Merciful Viscount? Ha, that's hilarious. Lloyd sneered, no matter if you're a noble or not, how could a little brat act like this? Diego, with his head pressed down, weakly gasped, you bastard, you insulted my parents, that's too much. Hearing this, Lloyd became even angrier. He pressed Diego's face down and roughly rubbed it against the wall, saying coldly, you think you're an exception, that you won't get beaten up? Dream on, you delusional idiot. After saying that, he violently pulled Diego's face from the wall and slammed it back again, shouting, why should I personally teach a twisted brat that there's no such thing as exceptions in this world? Because no one's ever beaten sense into you. Diego's face was slammed hard against the wall, blood clearly staining the wall. Lloyd pointed at the bloodstain, mocking, oh? What's this? What does this look like? After that, he slammed Diego's head into the wall again, roaring, it's 666. The gate to heaven. Specifically prepared for trash like you. At this moment, Julian suddenly lunged forward, tightly holding onto Lloyd, shouting, stop. Stop it. Enough. You'll kill him, you madman. But Julian thought to himself, what am I doing? Protecting him? Doesn't that just mean I'll get bullied even worse in the future? I should think this through. Lloyd said to Julian, are you worried you'll get bullied even worse in the future? Lloyd flashed a smile as pure as an angel descending from heaven and said, don't worry. If he dies, he can never bully you again. Julian felt a chill at Lloyd's words and thought in horror, why does he look so proud of what he's doing? And what on earth did I just hear? Lloyd threw a heavy punch at Diego's ribs, thinking to himself, that's right, in high school, he had seen too many despicable, shameless bastards like him. Punish him? Let him go. Ridiculous. He would never accept any pleas for mercy. After all, the fear of death is a very unique experience. Suddenly, a loud shout came from behind, stop immediately. Several soldiers pointing weapons at Lloyd appeared, followed by a few people. A bearded man stepped forward and loudly said, this is the Sacred Academy, protected by the Great Queen. Your actions have already constituted treason. Lloyd's eyes were filled with killing intent as he still held Diego's head. Julian stared at Lloyd in terror, thinking, no way, Lloyd isn't going to fight even the soldiers and the principal, is he? If he does, he'll definitely be sentenced to death. But surprisingly, Lloyd calmly lowered his head and bowed, saying, I think this is our first meeting, right? I am the eldest son of Baron Akos Frontera, and also the older brother of Julian Frontera. My name is Lloyd Frontera. Julian, standing aside, was also shocked at this scene. How could Lloyd be so calm? It was as if Lloyd had been waiting for this moment to happen. Lloyd lowered his head and apologized again, saying, I am deeply sorry for causing this chaos. I just wanted to restore the Queen's honor. The bearded man angrily shouted, nonsense. Who dares to insult the Queen's honor? Lloyd pointed at Diego, who was lying on the ground, beaten into a pulp, and said, it's that guy. He's the son of the Lacona family. My brother Julian has been bullied and insulted by him for a long time. Lloyd turned to the man standing aside and asked, you, the one standing in the back, do you have anything to say? You must have witnessed what happened just now, right? Or, did I misunderstand? It seems you didn't intend to stop me, but maybe I misunderstood? Lloyd thought to himself, there's no need to even think about why I didn't stop. Because all the students here are nobles recommended by their families. If I stop now, those nobles will still hate me. Moreover, these students have gathered together to babble nonsense, and this academy has already become a madhouse. It's not just the students' problem here, it's your problem too. Lloyd would never turn a blind eye to Julian being bullied. He had tolerated these people for too long. He was the son of a poor baron, so even if he helped Julian, he wouldn't gain anything from it. Lloyd reached into his clothes and said, insulting my brother is insulting me. So, what should I do? Lloyd took an object out of his clothes, held it up in front of everyone, and then opened it. When they saw what was inside, everyone immediately broke into a cold sweat, their faces full of fear. Lloyd smiled and said, this is the King's special gold medal. A royal high-ranking official's gold medal. Everyone immediately knelt down and shouted, long live the Queen. Long live. After everything settled, Lloyd calmly left, saying, you should understand the situation now, right? I'm leaving. The bearded man still kneeling on the ground secretly glanced at Lloyd, thinking, ha ha ha. This stupid idiot. The privilege of a royal official only belongs to one person. Once he's gone, we can just continue punishing Julian and treat the other students a bit better. But when he looked up at Lloyd, he suddenly froze. That angelic face appeared, and whenever this smile appeared, someone was about to suffer more than a dog. The bearded man quickly lowered his head, feeling a chill in his heart. What kind of expression is this? It looks like a warning, if I act up, he'll kill me. Lloyd turned and shouted, Julian, what are you waiting for? Come over here. Walking down the hallway, Julian asked Lloyd where they were going. Lloyd answered, the administrative office. Julian asked again, what are we going there for? Lloyd said, of course, to help you apply for a leave of absence. Julian suddenly stopped in his tracks and trembled as he asked, what do you mean, then suddenly shouted loudly. How far are you going to ruin everything before you're satisfied? You're the one who made me get bullied even worse in this academy. Now I can't even go to school anymore. Why are you doing this to me? Lloyd just smiled and said, anyway, studying in this environment will only get more difficult. Since that's the case, let's take this time to calm down and focus on physical training. Julian frowned and asked, what do you mean by physical training? Lloyd turned back and smiled, saying, Julian, have you ever heard this saying? The strongest muscles are trained through physical labor. That night, inside the Manetta Palace. In the VIP room, Javier and Julian were sitting and talking. Javier said, Julian, think about Lloyd's suggestion. Julian was shocked and replied, what are you talking about? We're talking about Lloyd. That lazy brother of mine. Javier answered calmly, Julian, don't you believe what he says? In Cremo, Lloyd killed a giant titan monster by himself and even took a fatal blow head-on. Lloyd also built roads and waterways. Not only that, he developed a coal mine and established friendly relations with the wild orcs. What's more, he even paid off half of the Baron's huge debts, and all of this, Lloyd did with his own hands. So, please believe in Lloyd. He is the true ruler of that land. Lloyd happened to pass by and overheard the conversation between Javier and Julian. Hearing himself praised, he happily rubbed his nose, checking to see if he was swelling up like a tomato from pride. In the room, the two continued discussing. Julian wanted to believe in Javier, but he couldn't accept that Lloyd had gone from a drunkard to what he was now. Javier nodded and said, indeed, Lloyd used to be arrogant and foolish. Julian added, he was a complete scumbag. Who could believe he was once a decent person? Standing outside, Lloyd heard himself being scolded, and his face immediately turned dark. Julian asked, Javier, what do you think? Do you really think someone can change this completely? Javier answered calmly, I think it's impossible. Not completely sure, but Javier thinks the other person who looks similar to Lloyd. After hearing Javier's answer, Lloyd also frowned and thought deeply. Lloyd stood outside the door, wondering if he had been discovered. The two people inside also fell into silence. No one said anything more. Julian asked if Javier meant that Lloyd's body had been taken over. Like black magic? Javier said maybe, if that's possible. This was just a hypothesis he read in a book. However, to stabilize someone's soul in another person's body requires a great deal of energy. So, Javier secretly checked and found that a powerful energy was protecting Lloyd's soul. Lloyd was also shocked upon hearing this, sweating cold, thinking, what? Did Javier really do this? Julian hurriedly asked Javier for the result. What was it? Was it another soul? Lloyd was also very worried outside, wanting to hear Javier's answer. Javier said there was no energy, the feeling of the body and soul was very natural, like a unified existence. After hearing Javier's result, Lloyd breathed a sigh of relief, no longer worried. Javier said forget it, that was just a meaningless guess. Julian agreed. But what was more unreasonable was that Lloyd had already changed. Lloyd was thinking outside the door, Javier, he couldn't have completely not noticed I'm standing outside, right? He must have wanted me to hear that. Is he saying I'm suspicious? Suddenly, Julian inside said that he had never heard of any debts in his family. Julian had always thought of himself as a very hard-working person, but during this period, it was Lloyd who did a lot to pay off the debts. You got it easily. Now, shouldn't you admit it? Lloyd saved your family's wealth. The system suddenly displayed, Julian's affection for you increased by 2. Gained 28 RP, like for you decreased by 59. After seeing the message, Lloyd smiled and rubbed his chin, thinking, because Julian was also Lloyd's protagonist, he was becoming the RP storage. At this moment, Lloyd opened the door and walked in, saying, Julian, are you ready? We should get going. Julian, still confused, said, what? What's going on? Lloyd showed a cunning smile and said, I told you already. Exercise. The first step is to prepare the suspension bridge cables. While doing it, Lloyd thought about smashing dirt to make 1-meter-long pizza dough. The second step, complete the pizza, adding various soils and stones as ingredients. The third step, make a delicious pizza for Belle to eat. Fourth, cast steel. Belle will be responsible for producing the steel bars. Fifth, after cooling, roll into 120 bundles. This task will be handled by Bobadon. Finally, complete the manufacturing of the cables. Lloyd handed the shovel to Julian and said, "All right, the explanation is finished." Lloyd also pointed out, this process is the starting point of the construction. If it goes wrong, everything will be ruined. In addition to our family debts, this will also determine the remainder of Julian's college career. Julian felt anxious and asked Lloyd, "Isn't this very important? Why are you leaving it to me?" Lloyd said, "What are you talking about, Julian? It is very important, so that's why someone as smart and reliable as you should take over the task. Stop throwing a tantrum." Hearing this from Lloyd, Julian was also surprised and froze. But then he frowned and thought, he just called me a tantrum thrower. The scene shifted to the palace. Lloyd, holding a pile of documents, walked while thinking, that's a suspension bridge. Using the technology of this era to make it is indeed a challenge, and it's absolutely impossible to complete it alone. So, he needs to rely on advanced technology. Lloyd walked up to a house. Inside, there was a beer-bellied man sitting, drinking. He said, "No. This is the royal dwarf, the craftsman named Court de Det." After hearing his refusal, Lloyd smiled and asked, "You haven't said anything yet?" He shouted, "I don't want to listen, go away," and took another sip of his drink. Lloyd stood, smiling while thinking, just like in novels, he's a grumpy old man. If you don't care about him, he won't do anything, not even the Queen's request. But Lloyd has a way. Lloyd smiled and unfolded the paper, saying, "This is the sketch of the newly built suspension bridge over the Makinta River. It is now called a framework structure." Court de Det impatiently picked up the bottle and seemed ready to throw it, saying, "Listen. A sketch designed by humans won't interest him." But suddenly, he stared at the sketch. Lloyd immediately rolled it up and said, "What a pity, let's skip this topic. I'll just go find another workshop." Court de Det slammed his hand on the table and frowned, saying, "Wait a minute." After hearing this, Lloyd glanced behind him, like a thief stealing a dog. Court de Det asked, "What will happen if the overall rigidity of this structure is not perfectly matched?" "Did you design it, Lloyd?" Lloyd replied, "Of course. It will crack, the bridge will collapse, and the people on the bridge will die. And you will be responsible for those deaths, and your head will go to the guillotine. But the premise is that Court de Det can do it." After hearing Lloyd's words, Court de Det widened his eyes and said, "Bastard. Is this a threat?" Lloyd just laughed and said, "I hope so." Then, with a sly expression, he glanced and said, "This is the master's call of conscience." Court de Det sighed, reached out, and said, "Let me see the details." Lloyd handed over the whole blueprint for Court de Det to examine one by one. After looking it over, Court de Det said, "I can guarantee that only I can do this in this kingdom. If someone else takes the contract, there will definitely be serious accidents." Lloyd again showed a sly expression and said, "That's why I'm putting pressure on you. No, I'm begging you." After seeing this expression, Court de Det angrily said, "Stop making that face." Lloyd still maintained that expression. Ah, is this giving the impression of an immoral jerk? If Lloyd could figure out this design, he must have a plan to spark his interest in it, right? Lloyd once again showed a sly expression and said, "How dare you? I have no choice but to rely on the mercy of a craftsman." Court de Det almost exploded upon seeing this expression, angrily saying, "Stop showing that face." However, he still found it interesting and decided to give it a try. He quickly bent down and said, "Thank you, Court de Det." Julian continued making steel wire. The bridge deck was being manufactured at the royal factory. Lloyd and Javier started building the main tower. The two were working with explosive large axes. Suddenly, someone behind them shouted loudly, "Stop the construction immediately." Several people walked over, bringing many soldiers. One person reached out and loudly shouted, "How dare you deceive the prince and plunder the royal treasury? This is unacceptable." Hearing this person speaking like a madman, Lloyd frowned and, with a bitter face, said, "What?" Inside the palace, someone knelt and said, "Your Majesty, please allow me to meet you." A bridge spanning the Makinta River has existed for 30 years. However, he is doing some unnecessary things, trying to get money from the royal family. I hope your majesty punishes this deceitful person and restores the royal treasury. In the Makinta palace, the queen gathered both sides' people and said, "Now, let me hear your reasons." Starting with the guild side, one person stood up and said, "This is the construction site manager of Makinta's capital, named Victor. The Makinta Bridge was built by the former guild president, and it has existed for 30 years. The wedge-shaped supports of the bridge help disperse the powerful water flow of the Makinta River. It's truly unbelievable that such a bridge collapsed. This is clearly an insult to both the guild and the queen." After hearing this name, Lloyd thought to himself, great. The bridge really collapsed. In the book Iron-Blooded Knight, there's a chapter that tells of a confrontation between the government army and the rebels on the Makinta River. Coincidentally, a heavy rain caused the bridge to collapse, blocking traffic. But he couldn't reveal future events. After hearing Victor's words, the queen glanced at Lloyd and said, "Now, Lloyd Frontera, tell me your opinion." Lloyd immediately said, "You should ask the official next to you, not the president." Lloyd's gaze was sharp as he smiled and asked, "How much did he get?" Upon hearing Lloyd's question, the two guys widened their eyes, looking somewhat scared. The person being asked angrily slammed the table and shouted, "Bastard! How dare Lloyd accuse others in front of the queen?" Lloyd sneered to himself, "Look at this reaction. Clearly, the money has already gone into my pocket." In Korea, anyone would know what happens when politicians and businessmen meet. Will the politician deceive the businessman? Or will the businessman bribe and tempt the politician? Probably the latter. By stripping away business power to create exclusive budget plans. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Lloyd Frontera." The queen coldly shot Lloyd a glance and said, "You think you're smart, but you've just made a big mistake." Seeing the queen's expression, Lloyd's forehead broke out in sweat as he swallowed nervously, feeling terrified. The queen continued, "Lloyd, how dare you accuse the royal judiciary without any evidence?" The two guys smiled smugly as the queen scolded Lloyd. "You're done for, old man. I truly wish you a smooth journey." The queen loudly ordered, "Someone prepare the sentence immediately." Lloyd was bound and forced to kneel. The executioner raised his large axe, ready to strike off Lloyd's head. The queen stood above and said loudly, "Listen, Lloyd Frontera. You fabricated lies to insult the queen and her attendants. Her attendants wished to restore her honor." Javier and the children nearby saw Lloyd about to be beheaded and felt panic and fear in their hearts. Javier raised his sword, preparing to fight to rescue Lloyd. The queen coldly asked Lloyd, "Do you have anything to say?" Lloyd lowered his head and said, "The guilty should have their families eradicated." The queen looked at the two men and asked, "Do they agree?" The two men bowed and said, "Definitely worth it." The queen continued, "Then, from now on." Hearing this, Javier gripped the hilt of his sword, worried the queen would order Lloyd's beheading, and then he would fight desperately to save him. But suddenly, there was a big twist. The queen said, "She will prove her attendants' innocence." The two men, upon hearing the queen's words, were drenched in cold sweat. 4 people in robes had already surrounded the official, making him feel uneasy, not understanding what was happening. At this moment, Lloyd wore a holy smile and looked at the official. The queen ordered at this moment, "Use divine magic to confess." The man screamed in fear, "Wait. Wait, your highness. Please. Unfortunately for you, I've already planned everything. How could you escape? You're dead for messing with me." Magic rays shot at him, making him howl in pain. Our protagonist smiled very kindly at this scene. "Congratulations, you've walked into a trap." The dusk scene, the entire sky was overcast, with the cawing of crows filling the surroundings. The two guys were dragged out, beaten up, and tied to a pillar for public display. Lloyd and Javier walked over to watch. Lloyd looked up at the two, saying, "Their families are innocent, so I'm only asking for this." Then Lloyd's eyes became bright, saying, "I'm truly too kind." Javier, listening to the young man, remembered his warm smile back at the palace. Lloyd was just a bit dissatisfied that these clowns delayed the project. The queen had already given the order, all the people of the kingdom will give their full effort to build the suspension bridge. Thanks to the high-level mages, the weight of the stones was reduced by absorbing magic. The tower was about to be completed. Next was the work on the suspension cables. Bio stood at one side of the tower, holding one end of the cable in his mouth. Following Lloyd's orders, Bio would rush out. He would fly toward the opposite tower. On the opposite tower's peak, Bobodong had been waiting to receive Bio. The cable was passed over and then secured to the pillar, locked in place, and then other cables were secured. The crowd below looked on in amazement at this scene. It was the first time they had seen such a thing. Among the crowd was also Javier. Suddenly, Julian appeared and said, "He's really impressive." Javier smiled and said, "Julian is also impressive. He completed all the tough work he had never done before and never gave up a single day. Do you remember? When we were kids, Julian once said to him, 'I want to learn swordsmanship.' That sword was so heavy it almost hurt him. Now, he didn't feel that way anymore." Julian had done manual labor for months, and both his hands and feet had become strong and sturdy. The bridge construction continued. The hippopotamus carried a beam and walked to the center to connect both ends. The mages used their magical power to secure the joints. When everything was done, Lloyd leisurely waved his shovel. Then he stuck the shovel into the ground, raised his hand, and shouted in celebration. The bridge was completed, and the system displayed an announcement: "The construction of the suspension bridge in the royal capital, Mactinta, has been completed." Based on the construction results, a large number of RP points were rewarded. Reward points increased, 1050 LP. Current points, 3090. Seeing these points, Roy thought, "I haven't spent anything, I've saved up. Now I'm finally rich in RP." The queen stood on the newly constructed bridge and ordered, "This bridge will be named after Roy Frontera and his brave knights. It will be called Roy Bobby. Moreover, with the queen's authority, Roy will be titled Master of Craftsmanship." Hearing this title, the crowd cheered excitedly. Kurt D. Det stood among them, drinking and muttering, "I made the bridge deck." However, Roy was the only one capable of designing something like this. He would acknowledge that. While kneeling to hear the title, Roy thought, "Now that we've received such a large construction fund, it should solve the family's debts." But there's still one big obstacle. Roy glanced at the queen. She was staring at Roy as well. She thought, "So, how should I use this opportunity? There are many ways to take advantage of it." Roy also thought, maybe the queen is thinking, "How can I use you?" Absolutely not. My dream is to become wealthy and live lazily. Enjoy food and drink lying down, without needing to do anything but still eat well. Let's go with the plan. The queen said, "There's something I need Roy for, let's talk in the palace." Roy smiled and thought, solving Julian Academy's problem while also getting rid of the queen's control, what a two-in-one deal. Soon, everyone returned to the palace. Roy and Javier knelt below, listening to the queen's rewards. "In the name of Queen Alicia Taman McKinta, I hereby announce, Roy Frontera will be granted a territory and a title appropriate to his abilities." After hearing the title, the officials felt somewhat dissatisfied. The queen stood and thought with a sidelong glance, although he's the son of a country baron, Roy is the one who punished these senior officials. Having land and a title is quite unpleasant. What a nuisance. How can I appease these complaints? Roy spoke from below, "Thank you, Your Majesty. But I request your forgiveness and ask for a greater favor." Hearing this, the officials thought Roy wanted more things, their faces showing displeasure. The queen asked, "Greater?" "Roy, tell me." Roy said, "If you think what I said is reasonable, please keep my land and title." Upon hearing Roy's words, the queen exclaimed, "She will decide after listening." But thought to herself, what does Roy really want? The kingdom's officials, or even higher construction funds? Whatever it is, she will keep Roy by her side. Roy then spoke, "I only ask for one thing, give it to the Royal Academy. More precisely, clean it up." The queen furrowed her brows after hearing Roy's words, not understanding the situation, and spoke. "Explain it to me." Roy told her, McIntyre Royal Academy is full of troubles, unreasonable things, and some shameful actions. The students are more inclined to form factions rather than study. This harms the children from humble backgrounds both mentally and physically. The Academy's teachers are all aware of this, but they turn a blind eye. They proved this by accepting bribes. The students are focused on their studies while enjoying the sweet ambition of pursuing global power. Yet, over time, they find themselves surrounded by the solid walls of the classroom. The purpose for which the Academy was established has strayed too far off course. Upon hearing everything Roy said, many of the officials began sweating heavily and felt fearful. Roy immediately called for Javier. He reached into his clothes as if to take something out. He walked over and handed the item to the Queen for inspection. Roy continued to report, "This is what I and the guards have discovered in the past 4 months. A graduate, a diligent person, and even a conscientious professor. Those who were tired of such unreasonable things have already left the Academy. All the testimonies and materials have been carefully recorded." By this point, some officials began shouting, "Your Majesty, those lowly people are lying." "That's right, how could this happen at the Royal Academy?" The Queen looked at the materials and coldly said, "Those who just spoke, perform the divine ritual, confess." 5 people were dragged in and cast spells. Then, a few were hung on pillars, beaten, and then taken out to be displayed. The scene shifted to McIntyre Academy. A voice loudly shouted, "His Majesty arrives." At this moment, scenes of arrests, binding, and escorting were happening within the Academy. The Queen, with soldiers, raised her hand and shouted, "Arrest everyone on the list. Leave no one connected to this behind. Everyone will be punished for their respective crimes, demotion, confiscation of property, and be prepared for a possible death sentence." At this time, Roy and Javier stood on a high point overlooking the Academy. Below, groups of arrested people screamed, "We did nothing. Please save me. Save me. It's a trap." Roy stood with a very kind smile, feeling very satisfied with what he had done. Javier stood beside him and asked, "Roy, aren't you glad to see the Academy cleaned up?" Roy smiled and said, "Javier, what are you talking about?" "No." A treacherous face, grinning, said, "The Queen now has completely forgotten about your existence. Now, you can just secretly enjoy life." Javier said, "I know Roy is happy, but is it necessary to put on that kind of look?" Suddenly, a Queen's guard appeared behind Roy and spoke. "The Queen has sent him a message." This startled Roy, leaving him somewhat uneasy. He announced, "Roy, you can go anywhere, but make sure you attend the banquet tomorrow night. Also, using the Academy as a cover is a great undercover operation." The Queen said she respects Roy's playful mood. After hearing this, Roy also broke into a sweat, thinking, so that's the Queen's subordinate. After speaking, the guard turned and left. Roy looked at the Queen's guard's back and said, "I'm really surprised. Javier, didn't you notice he was approaching?" Javier shook his head and said, "Not at all." He told Roy, "He is the kingdom's strongest swordsmanship master, Mr. Ken. For knights like Javier, he could easily hide his presence, almost like flipping his hand." Back in the palace's VIP room, Julian asked, "Roy, have you been expecting all of this? Is this why you dealt with that Diego?" Roy stated, "That's basically it." He had finished the construction contract given by the Queen. If Julian wanted to reward him, then he should investigate the Academy. He trusted logic and knew it would succeed. After hearing Roy's words, Julian fell into deep thought. Seeing that Julian wasn't speaking, Roy called out, "Palmson." Roy asked, "What's wrong, Palmson?" Julian smiled and said, "Roy, no need to call me Palmson anymore, because now you are someone I can trust and be proud of." Hearing Julian's words, Roy was also very surprised. System notification: Julian Frontera believes you are the hero who awakened during the family crisis. He has opened his heart, respects, and acknowledges you. Julian's affection for you has increased by 65. Earned 910 RP. Total RP, 3929. The two were silent for a while. Roy couldn't help but say something disgusting, and Julian began to regret it. It was really disgusting. The scene shifts to the royal banquet the next evening. The queen walked over and said, "Roy Frontera, come here." Roy was hiding in the corner, trying to avoid being noticed. Hearing his name called, he immediately broke into a cold sweat. The queen walked over and said, "Roy, did you think I didn't notice you? You stand out like a cricket." Roy, nervous, said, "Ah, is someone coming?" Javier, seeing the queen approaching, bowed and greeted, "Your Majesty." The queen asked, "Oh? Does Javier think the same?" Javier said, "Indeed, like a cricket." The queen said, "No doubt, Roy is truly a rabbit." Hearing Roy being mocked, Javier happily laughed. Roy, seeing this, thought, "Why is this so sudden? Look at him so relaxed." The queen spoke at this moment, "Didn't you hear me telling Roy to come closer?" Roy quickly lowered his head, shifted a bit, and said, "I'm very sorry." They both were silent for a moment. She said, "A little closer." Roy moved a bit more, and the queen said, "Closer." Then, closer. By this point, their faces were very close. Sweat poured from Roy like a fountain. The queen slowly said, "A little closer." Roy stammered, I don't dare get any closer to you, Your Majesty." She began to whisper in Roy's ear, trying to say, "If Roy changes his mind, he can come to her any time. She'll have everything ready. Ah. This deal smells so good. Just take it when you meet, go straight for it, why wait?" After whispering, the queen turned and left, saying, "This banquet is prepared for you. Enjoy." Roy clenched his fists and smiled, thinking, what kind of joke is this? Of course. The best way is to eat, drink, and have fun. But, what if a natural disaster happens, or something goes wrong with the territory? When that happens, I'll work, earn money, and then get a generous retirement insurance. Ah, I really want to go home. I've already received the construction payment, now all that's left is to enjoy. How wonderful. But suddenly, Roy realized something. No waiting. This is something that will tarnish the Queen's reputation 3 years from now. At that time, all the insurance will disappear. At this moment, the Queen's guard appeared behind her and said, "The banquet will last until the moon sets." Roy was startled. He knew this line. It's this line. When the Queen was poisoned and lost one of her arms. The secret code shared by the conspirators who assassinated the Queen. This line wouldn't appear until 3 years later. So why is this line coming out of Ken's mouth now? After the Queen left the banquet and returned to her room, she wearily sat in a chair. She reached up and rubbed her head, thinking, did I drink too much? Everything seems normal. Maybe I've overdone it these past few days. The Academy, prepare to deal with the losses from the flood. And the National Action Plan. And the enemy, the Assyrians. Samakanan eyes it, he is gathering troops in the western Assyrian region. According to inside sources, could this be military training for an invasion? Impossible. If it were an invasion, they would concentrate on the northern border. Crossing the vast wilderness would be like suicide. What exactly are they planning to do? While she was thinking, she suddenly felt a headache. She thought, this is strange. How can the alcohol concentration perfectly neutralize the energy inside me like this? She couldn't control her heartbeat. Her breathing became rapid. She placed her hand on her chest and felt a difficulty breathing. Energy. She could neutralize it by manipulating energy. Suddenly, her heart began to pound violently. The pain was unbearable, and she collapsed on the table, screaming. Now, she understood. Poison. It's poison. But how could this be? She had carefully inspected all the food. She struggled to stand up and then shouted with effort. Is anyone there? She began to feel everything distorting. Suddenly, there was a sound of someone opening the door. She struggled to walk toward the door. The person walking toward her was her guard, Ken. She weakly stretched out her hand and said, "How wonderful." In this chaotic moment. "Please, your hand." The guard coldly said, according to the Queen's words, he's glad to have arrived in time. He will help her enter a deep sleep. When the sword was drawn, it was already covered in a lot of blood. Seeing this, the queen was shocked but couldn't believe it. The scene switched to the outside, where Loy called Javier, mentioned work-related matters, and then left. The two hurriedly walked down the corridor. As they walked, Loy asked, "Isn't Javier going to ask what's going on?" Javier said he also felt a strange energy and wondered what to do. Loy simply said, "Defeat the sword master." Hearing Loy's words, Javier frowned and asked, "What are you joking about? Now is not the time." Loy worriedly said, "Does this take a long time?" Javier replied, 2 minutes. Loy immediately said, 1 minute. Then both of them sped up and started running. On the way, Javier casually pulled a candle holder off the wall. As they ran, Javier said, 3 minutes. Loy shouted, "All right, charge forward." The two soon reached a fork in the road. At a glance, several people were already lying in pools of blood on the ground. Over at the queen's side, Ken had already made a powerful slash. The queen struggled to block the attack. He gripped his sword tightly and said, "Not bad." Even poisoned, the queen still blocked his 3 sword strikes. The queen angrily shouted, "Why is he doing this?" Suddenly, Ken kicked the queen in the stomach. She was hit and fell to the ground, clutching her stomach. Ken seized the opportunity, swinging his sword to decapitate her. But he suddenly froze because he sensed a certain danger. From behind, Javier arrived in time and thrust the candle holder. Ken quickly dodged the attack. He immediately used magic. Turning around, he slashed at Javier with all his might. Javier barely blocked the attack. Ken was also a little surprised, thinking, "He actually used a candle holder to block my sword? Who is this person?" At this moment, Javier also began to release his power. With a powerful collision, the candle holder in Javier's hand began to emit green light. Ken, seeing this, was completely confused about what was happening. Javier swung the candle holder, pushing Ken back. Seeing this strike, Ken thought, "What is that? Using such a strange energy method." Javier shouted loudly and then charged forward to attack. Lightning flashed continuously, striking Ken rapidly, causing him to keep retreating to defend. At this moment, Loy ran over, holding his head with both hands, and said, "Are you okay, Your Highness?" She was also surprised by Loy's appearance and immediately said, "Loy, how did you?" Loy covered the queen's mouth with his hand and said, "We'll talk later." Loy placed his hand on the queen's abdomen, thinking about how Asahan absorbs energy. Loy began to draw every bit of magical power from the queen's body into his own. Meanwhile, the battle was still intense. Javier launched a strike, and Ken jumped back to dodge. He began to release his power, with the sword glowing with a hazy purple light. Javier saw this and thought, "Radiant swordsmanship? Only a swordmaster can use it. Once he's ready, it's all over." Javier immediately threw the candle holder at Ken. Ken hit the candle holder away with his sword. Javier immediately rushed forward and caught the candle holder that was knocked back. He quickly grabbed the candle holder and raised it behind him. Then he unleashed a powerful slashing strike. Ken, seeing Javier's attack, thought, "I have to admit, Javier is a genius at energy conversion and skill usage." But Javier still lacks experience. Ken charged forward and immediately landed a ribhook punch on Javier. Then he widened his eyes and raised his sword. He swung a powerful slash at Javier. The attack hit the ground, causing the earth to crack. The candle holder couldn't withstand the powerful slash and was split in half. Javier's chest was also slashed, with blood splattering. On this side, Loy's face showed purple veins. As Loy absorbed the queen's magical power, he thought, "Javier, it's up to you. If you lose, we'll all die here." After Ken struck Javier, he smiled. He looked at Javier and thought, "This wound is shallow, but the damage is very clear. Now is his time to strike." Immediately, he tightly gripped his sword and charged forward. On this side, Javier didn't fall back but instead charged toward Ken at the fastest speed. Seeing Javier charging at him, Ken was also surprised and couldn't react in time, thinking, "Is he coming at me? This madman. Isn't he afraid?" Ken immediately swung a sweeping slash, but Javier tilted his body in time and slid on the floor, avoiding the strike. Javier suddenly shouted, "Papadong!" Papadong got the queen's sword and started spinning it like a top. Then he threw the sword. Ken missed the strike and quickly turned around to continue attacking. But by this time, Javier had already grabbed the sword that Papadong had thrown. He shouted and then charged at Javier. Javier glared at Ken. Then he leaped up and used his burst/skill. As Ken charged toward him, a flash of light passed in front of him. He hurriedly raised his sword to block, but couldn't withstand it, and shouted as he was sent flying. This strike sent Ken flying, crashing through 2 doors, and throwing him out of the room. He struggled to get up, thinking, Javier's attack is like a cannonball? Ridiculous. Before he could react, the second burst/slash was already coming at him. He hurriedly covered his head and ran. Javier immediately chased after him like lightning. He immediately used his burst shot skill. Beams of light shot out from the tip of Javier's sword. Ken ran, almost losing his pants, dodging a few beams of energy, thinking, oh my god. He's a monster. Back to Loy, he was gritting his teeth, enduring the pain. Loy was trying to absorb the toxins from the queen's body. At this point, the queen had also woken up. As soon as she opened her eyes, she saw Loy. Seeing Loy using his skill, she thought, how is this possible? Loy is absorbing my magical power? Not only that, he's absorbing the poisoned magic. She hurriedly spoke, Loy, what ability is this? Loy gritted his teeth and said, don't speak, I can't concentrate. The queen said, I'm sorry. Huh? What's going on? She widened her eyes and said, did Loy just curse at me? Loy immediately said, no. Maybe it's because you're poisoned, your hearing is messed up. The queen said, what? I don't think so. Loy quickly said, sorry, your highness. But please slow down. Suddenly, Loy coughed up blood. The queen saw this and stared at Loy, thinking. What is Loy doing? Does he really want to save me, even if it kills him? On the other side, Ken was still running away in panic. Before he could do anything, a fireball came straight at him. The explosion shook the back of the banquet hall, and everyone was startled. Ken was blasted into the banquet hall. Javier slowly walked out from the smoke. He stared at Ken, thinking, you can't escape. He looked at Javier, squinted, and thought, dealing with Javier, this is such a waste of time. He laughed, thinking Javier was such a fool. He raised his hand and shouted, soldiers. Listen carefully. This man dared to assassinate the princess with his accomplices. Draw your swords and protect the queen. The soldiers heard Ken's words, and they all raised their weapons and walked towards Javier. Ken shouted, capture him. The soldiers immediately charged at Javier. Javier didn't retreat, raising his sword in preparation. He gritted his teeth and swung, sending 3 charging soldiers flying. Then, he gathered mana into his sword. He swung again, sending several more soldiers flying. Ken stood behind, observing, thinking, Javier sent 3 elite soldiers flying with just one swing of his sword. I've never heard of such an outstanding person in history. If Javier could reach the level of a swordmaster, then Javier could easily destroy a small kingdom. But that won't happen because Javier will die here. Ken, standing behind, had gathered his power into his sword and said, step aside, I'll be Javier's opponent. Javier saw the purple light flashing and thought, sword light sword technique. Ken switched the sword to one hand and swung it forward. A purple light flashed. Javier was sent flying. Then, an extremely destructive force swept through everything in front. Javier was also sent flying, his sword shattered. Ken slowly walked in. Javier was seriously injured, lying on the ground. Ken was slowly walking towards Javier. The scene shifted to Loy. He had successfully extracted the poison from the queen's body, but he was in intense pain all over. He struggled to stand up and began to move. But he immediately coughed up black blood. Seeing this, the queen hurriedly said, Loy, if you continue like this, you will die. Focusing mana in one hand, she would help him. Loy gritted his teeth in pain and thought. Then, she would cut off his hand like in the novel. But he wouldn't let that happen to him. If that happened, digging would be inconvenient. How could he use a shovel with only one hand? Loy immediately grabbed a nearby dinner knife. He knelt down, holding the knife with both hands and extended it forward. Then, he shouted loudly. The tip of the knife emitted a blinding purple light. Loy released the skill, explosion slash. The strike soared upwards, directly piercing through the palace ceiling. Ken heard the explosion and turned to look. He furrowed his brows, thinking, what happened? It seems like a massive mana explosion. What did Loy do? Suddenly, Javier woke up. He tightly gripped the broken sword hilt and barely stood up. Ken saw this and thought, after his light sword technique, he was still able to stand up. Javier's gaze was blurry, his whole body trembling. He pointed the broken sword forward. Because he had sworn an oath, he would honor his blood vow. Time reversed, going back to a clear, moonlit night in the past. Two young men were talking. Loy glanced over and asked, what is this? Javier, with a hint of sadness on his face, said. As Loy's knight, he had abandoned his responsibilities and rushed to Giga Titan. He was even disappointed that Loy didn't cooperate with him. He once wanted to rely on Loy. But in the end, he was always like this, mentally fragile, lacking strength. And indifferent to his own responsibilities. He truly didn't have the ability to be a knight. After hearing Javier's words, Loy sighed and said, really, what Javier said isn't that serious. Anyway, isn't Javier currently having his 6-month salary withheld? Javier looked at Loy without saying a word. The two sat there in silence. Javier began the negotiation, saying, 3 months? Loy asked, do you think I'll agree? Javier said, no. Loy replied, then why ask? Javier looked at the fire and said, I swear, it's for Loy's guardian sword. I will never abandon my duty again. Loy immediately said, swearing while playing with fire, do you expect me to believe it? Javier said, Loy doesn't need to believe me. But I will still keep my vow. Loy replied, suit yourself. Javier knew that Loy had reached the 3rd stage of the circle. He would catch up soon, so he could continue to be Loy's guardian knight. So, he would definitely become a swordsmanship master this year. Loy laughed and said, why does Javier's voice sound so strange? It sounds like he thinks I'll gain 5 kilograms this year. Javier said, that's not just empty talk. Then, the two fell silent again. At this moment, Loy picked up a twig and said, listen. Humans can enhance the mana in their hearts to a certain limit, right? If we follow the theory, Javier can't go any further. Even if he practices for hundreds of years, how could he become a swordsmanship master? Loy thought, even with vast mana, it's impossible. Suddenly, Javier wiped away the diagram that Loy drew with his foot, making Loy angry and shout, hey! Javier said, this time, I'll do it myself. I no longer need Loy's help. Back to the present. Ken was charging forward with a sword. Javier, holding a broken sword, charged as well, thinking, with my own strength, I will become a swordsmanship master. But Ken had already pierced Javier's body with his sword. A powerful burst of mana exploded from the sword. Ken glanced at him and said, Javier, you surprised me. Any normal body would have been torn to pieces after being pierced by his glorious swordsmanship. Did Javier strengthen his mana body, instantly reinforcing his entire body? If that's the case, give him some applause. Javier's technique is truly remarkable. Now, die. Javier's whole body was burned black by the explosive mana. The pain made him scream out loud. Suddenly, Javier grabbed Ken's hand. He tightly grasped Ken's arm and pulled him towards himself. Ken, panicked, shouted, this crazy bastard. What the hell are you doing? Javier gritted his teeth and thought, the mana released by Ken's glorious swordsmanship is burning my body. Let it flow through the sword and enter his hand. Then pierce through his heart. Finally, his mana heart. At this moment, Ken shouted loudly and then suddenly raised his sword, lifting Javier up. He swung the sword violently, throwing Javier out. He was thrown out and slammed hard against the wall. Then he fell to the ground. At this point, Javier was lying there, motionless. Ken walked over and stared at Javier, thinking, he doesn't feel any breath. Nor does he feel the flow of mana. He wasted too much time. Now, go take the queen's head. He turned around, ready to leave. Suddenly, a voice sounded, I see. From behind, Javier had already stood up. Ken turned around, hardly believing his eyes. Javier softly said, the mana of a swordsmanship master? In his hand, the broken sword emitted a green glow. A new sword shape was forming. Ken widened his eyes, thinking, what is that? Is it a glorious swordsmanship? He had never heard of such a thing. Javier gently turned the sword. Then a burst of power exploded, making the sword even larger. He then swung the sword towards Ken. Ken hurriedly raised his sword to defend. Then he unleashed the glorious swordsmanship. But unfortunately, as the rumors said, his attack was like a mosquito biting iron. His glorious swordsmanship was crushed the moment it touched Javier's attack. Luckily, he dodged Javier's powerful strike. But, he suddenly realized something was wrong. His arm had already been severed by Javier. He lay on the ground, clutching his wound and screaming in pain. The soldiers outside ran over to help Ken. Suddenly, a voice sounded. Javier shoved his sword into the ground, glaring angrily, and said, anyone who dares to step forward will face the sword of a swordsmanship master. In the queen's room, she was shouting Loi's name loudly. She held Loi's hand and said, open your eyes. Don't you have the ability to absorb mana? Then absorb mine. But, the only response was silence. The queen shouted Loi's name loudly, thinking, how could we lose such a talent? Wake up. Loi gradually began to wake up. The system suddenly notified, successfully survived the jibing toxin mark. Unlock new skill, heart mana immunity. Immunity to all toxins. In the extreme state, when the skill is activated, mana will be absorbed from the external environment. Seeing these notifications, Loi thought. What is this? All advanced skills? This is amazing. Seeing something good, Loi flashed a charming smile in his dazed state. A truly evil smile. The queen saw this smile and couldn't help but furrow her brows, veins popping out. She immediately punched Loi in the head. That smile was just too disgusting. After being punched, Loi fully regained his consciousness. He turned around and asked the queen, why did you hit my head? The queen hesitated before answering, I don't know. But Loi's face. Loi asked, what's wrong with my face? The queen said, forget about it. Do you feel better? Can you stand up? Loi replied, I'm not sure either. My legs are shaking. Thinking to himself, I need to hurry and help Javier. Now, he had no other choice but to try this move. Loi decided to activate the extreme speed skill. His whole body began to emit a green glow. The surrounding mana heart began to spin, speeding up more and more. Then, mana began to explode. The queen sat nearby, watching in astonishment as the surrounding mana was absorbed by Loi faster and faster, and said, what? What's happening? Loi's whole body began to shine even brighter as the absorbed mana became more intense. The items in the room began to slowly decay under Loi's absorption power. The queen, seeing this, thought in panic, this absorption ability is too amazing. At this rate, my mana will be absorbed too. She shouted, wait, Loi. Seeing Loi lying there with his eyes closed, she thought, Loi didn't hear her. But he saved her life. Then, let him fulfill his wish. And use his own power to help that night. Loi was surrounded by the mana that had been attracted to him. The queen beside him also began to feel the strength of Loi's absorption. The entire room was covered with waves of mana energy. Suddenly, Loi woke up. At this point, the entire room was almost completely destroyed. The system displayed a notification. Heart mana skill has reached near swordsmanship master level. Unlocking new unique option, Frenzied Spirit. Within 60 seconds, you will enter frenzy mode. You will only attack the designated target. In non-frenzy mode, stamina and reaction speed are increased by 200%. Can only be used once per day. Looking at the series of notifications, Loy, just waking up, didn't fully understand. He sat up and thought, my body feels so light. It's like I've just been fully charged. At that moment, he suddenly remembered, that's right. Javier. He must be fighting that swordsmanship master alone. But when he turned around, he was shocked. The queen, having been drained by Loy's absorption, was weakly collapsed beside him. Loy hurriedly turned his head and looked around, thinking, what's going on? What happened to her? Was she affected by the skill? At that moment, the queen suddenly spoke. She would ask Loy for the details later. Right now, stopping Ken was the top priority. She asked Loy, can you carry me? Loy quickly picked up his coat and put it over her, then knelt and said to her, by God's will. While thinking, the queen, she's so cool. She doesn't care at all what others think. Loy picked up the queen and stood up, saying, ready. Let's go. Then, Loy ran down the hallway like a madman with the queen on his back, thinking, Javier, wait, your master is coming to help you. The queen, sitting on Loy's back, squinted her eyes and thought, Javier is undoubtedly a genius at controlling mana. But that's still not enough to defeat swordsmanship master Ken on his own. She closed her eyes, trying to gather some mana. At least she could do 1/3 of her usual amount. Soon, the two of them ran outside. In the hallway, Javier stood there, firmly blocking everyone and not letting anyone cross the line, just behind him. When they walked by, they couldn't help but widen their eyes. They saw the sword in Javier's hand and thought, that sword of the glorious swordsmanship is indeed the glorious swordsmanship. Javier did it. Ken had been defeated. The queen walked from behind, raised her hand and said, put down your weapons. At this moment, several soldiers were stunned because they didn't understand what was happening. The queen hurriedly spoke, the mastermind behind the assassination of the queen is Ken over there. These two people were taking great risks. And saved her life. Please show respect and etiquette in front of these heroes. After hearing the queen's explanation, the soldiers stood straight, raised their weapons, and showed their respect to the two of them. The queen walked out and began to give orders. Everyone in the banquet hall will be investigated today. This is a safety measure for the royal family, please cooperate. Loy then walked over and asked, has Javier become a swordsmanship master? Javier turned around and said, yes, why? Loy angrily said, how can Javier say that so calmly? Javier replied, oh, what would you want me to say? At that moment, Javier withdrew the swordsmanship master's power and said, from now on, Loy will face even more dangerous situations. This is the only way to complete my escort mission. Loy still couldn't understand what this godlike figure was thinking. He smiled and said, whatever, let Javier do what he wants. Thinking, I'm just glad Javier is all right. Suddenly, the system sent a notification, tonight, you've achieved another great accomplishment. The hidden condition has been met by the massive energy you have gathered so far. Looking at the notification, Loy was stunned, thinking, oh? What is this? What has it sent me today? The system continued, system reward activated. Every achievement will bring you a new skill. Every honor you hold will grant you honor points each month and on every full moon. Honor list, big wood, complete body break. Desperate CPR. I'm going to slam my face into the ORC. Well done Cremo Lobster. Magentano Fisherman. Seeing these honors, Loy thought angrily, what the hell is this? Shouldn't they be noble titles? Like Cremo's Guardian or Magent Hero or something. Why can't they give me a cooler name? The system immediately responded, honor names are based on your facial appearance. Loy saw this message and was nearly driven mad, thinking, is this guy messing with me? Can't I get a different name? Loy rubbed his chin, looked at the message board, and thought, if I can gain honors, and if the skills develop, that could be a good thing. Loy opened one of the honor entries to check. Well done Cremo Lobster. Unlocking all regions of Cremo Province, including Cremo Territory. Honor Maintenance Stage, 125 CP9. Honor effect lasts for 24 hours in the region. The duration of the honor will change based on your actions. Regions and stages will expand, extend, terminate, or shorten. Reward effect: when fighting an enemy 10 times stronger than you, activate endurance, deal double damage, and reduce incoming damage by half. Looking at this information, Loy was stunned, thinking, what is this? What type of power enhancement? Do all honors have effects? So what exactly is the CP for? The system doesn't tell him. Asking is useless. The system replied, I was going to tell you, but your face is so awful, so I won't tell you. Loy immediately pleaded with the system to tell him. The system continued, what are you saying? I didn't hear anything. Lloyd clasped his hands together, crying, begging the system for forgiveness and to tell him. The system sent a message, laughing, dream on, baby, keep praying. Javier, seeing Lloyd kneeling and praying to the air, squinted slightly, thinking, what is this guy doing now with his nonsense? After a lot of pleading, the system finally sent a notification. When you use the collected CP, you will gain the power to resist the laws of the world. End of revelation. This is what it can do. Seeing this message, Lloyd was greatly shocked. The next day, Lloyd stretched lazily in the VIP room. He sat in the chair, murmuring to himself, I'm so tired. Due to this investigation, I haven't slept all night. Julian stood beside him and asked, so, did Lloyd figure out who's behind Ken? Lloyd rubbed his hair. Not yet. They said they are using a confession spell. What's the point of resistance for anyone who says the secret word? I knew it wouldn't go smoothly. In the end, because of this, leaving the capital became impossible. So now, Lloyd can only stay here. Lloyd sat there lost in thought. He wanted to resolve this quickly and go home. But this assassination wasn't part of the novel. It might have been mentioned in the second part, but these events happened much earlier than the 3 years ago mentioned in the novel. At this rate, there may be more changes in the future. If this continues, it will be troublesome. My future insight card will become useless. He only had skills that required CP to see the outcome. Are these really the skills he can use? While lost in thought, Julian asked, what about Javier? Is he still being investigated? Lloyd replied, the Queen has summoned Javier. Because Javier is a swordsmanship master. Julian was startled when he heard Lloyd and shouted, what? After hearing Julian shout, Lloyd said, why are you so surprised? Javier defeated Ken. Clearly, only a swordsmanship master could have that ability. Julian thought Javier had been captured for helping the army. Lloyd pointed at his head and said, Julian, are you okay? No 100 guards could defeat a swordsmanship master, right? The two of them stared at each other. Julian looked at Lloyd, confused, then why summon Javier? Cut to the palace. The Queen sat on the throne and said, through this incident, we have confirmed Javier's unprecedented swordsmanship skills and the resilience of his swordsmanship aura, which has not been recorded before. As Javier knows, the position of captain of the Royal Guard is currently vacant. Therefore, I am ordering Javier. From now on, as the captain of the Royal Guard, stand by my side. In the room, Lloyd briefly explained to Julian why Javier was summoned. He was a little worried. Will Javier leave us? In the palace, Javier pondered for a while before speaking. Please forgive my rudeness, Your Majesty. On the other side, Lloyd heard Julian's words, glanced at him, and fell into thought. Then he frowned and asked, isn't Julian close to Javier? In the palace, Javier knelt and said, I, the humble knight of Southern Noble Akut Ferrant, please understand, I cannot leave him. Upon hearing that Javier refused to become the captain of the Royal Guard, the Queen's expression became cold, and she stared at Javier coldly. She asked Javier, do you know what I am asking for? Disobeying the Queen's orders is equivalent to treason. Javier knows the cost of doing this, right? Javier's gaze was a bit sad as he said, please make the decision. But allow me to write a farewell letter to the Southern Noble. The Queen rested her chin on her hand and said, it's best you just kill me. What a truly noble thing to say. Javier softly said, please forgive my sins. The Queen frowned slightly at this moment, remaining silent. Then, she spoke, continue. She respected Javier's wishes. Javier then said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." Afterward, he stood up and bowed to the queen. Then he left the palace. In the corridor, someone suddenly called out Javier's name. Julian, with a melancholic expression, walked toward Javier, because he thought Javier would have to serve as the queen's guard. Julian hesitated and asked, "Your Highness, what did you say?" "It should be." At that moment, Javier smiled and said, "I am always a knight of the Frontera family." Upon hearing that Javier wouldn't leave, Julian finally smiled happily. In the palace, the queen sat, thinking. The Frontera estate. The place I am in is not very famous. That night, the moonlight filtered through the clouds, faintly visible. Lloyd lay on the grass, opening the system to check. Looking at the information bar, Lloyd pondered, "Let's see, the skills provided by other achievements. Broken bones. Did you get this when you drove away Norman? The people of Frontera received absolute blessings. I'll also put your face on the ORC. This can be used. ORC's roar. Magenta Fishman, oh, this is great. Gained the absolute trust of Queen Alicia, not suspected of being a traitor in the conspiracy. He has already punished those nobles. No matter how those old men set traps, he will still be safe." Lloyd lay there, suddenly looking up at the sky. The dark clouds gradually dispersed, and the moon became brighter. The system suddenly sent a message. The full moon illuminated the night sky. CP gained from 5 tributes. You have obtained CP 22. Lloyd sat up, crossed his arms, and focused intently on the system screen. Ending reveal. By consuming CP, you can roughly view the ending scene of the current story chapter's final part. The first required CP amount, 20. Would you like to use the ending reveal? Looking at the system panel, Lloyd had a perverted expression on his face, thinking, no matter how I think about it, in the current situation, I can only see one future. If I get fatter from eating too many sweets, wouldn't that be terrible? Try it. Lloyd immediately pressed the agree button. The surroundings became dim. Lloyd saw darkness all around him, feeling a bit scared, and said, "What is this? It's a bit scary." Messenger? Mr. Messenger? Suddenly, the scenery around Lloyd changed. The area was surrounded by flames. Lloyd stood there, looking around, thinking, where am I now? This place seems a bit familiar. Is this the Frontera estate? But, the house, the trees, why has it turned like this? Lloyd saw something and was startled. There was a corpse nearby. He panicked and ran away, thinking, what is this? What is this? As he ran down the path, more and more dead bodies appeared, making Lloyd even more worried. What's going on? How can the ending be like this? He reached out and shouted, "Hey! Is anyone here? Someone respond." As he ran, he shouted at the system, "Hey, is this really the message to be conveyed? Will this really happen? Hey, can you hear me?" After running for a while, Lloyd stopped. The future scene. He and Javier had returned to the estate. He widened his eyes, barely able to believe it. Sir South and his wife were dead at the estate gate. The future Lloyd sat there and said, "If I had come earlier, then. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm really sorry." Knowing the future outcome, Lloyd gritted his teeth. He stood up and yelled to the sky. "Why is this the ending?" Suddenly, a buzzing sound made him turn to look. From afar, a black cloud was drifting toward them. Upon closer inspection, it wasn't a cloud. It was winged creatures flying. A group of monsters, with sharp teeth and 2 blood-red eyes. Lloyd looked at these monsters and realized, they were locusts. Suddenly, Javier walked out holding a sword. At this moment, he had gone mad and drew his sword. He roared in anger and slashed his sword. The force rushed towards the group of monsters. Javier immediately slashed again. The second wave of force flew up. Without stopping, Javier seemed to concentrate all his power and fiercely slashed a third time. The 3 waves of force charged towards the monster group. In mid-air, the monster group was split apart by Javier. Lloyd watched and thought to himself, he did it. Suddenly, from behind, a swarm of locusts flew towards them. The whole swarm of locusts pounced on Javier. More and more of them appeared. At that moment, Lloyd was pushed out of the future vision. He kneeled on the grass, stunned, unable to believe it. Lloyd called out to the system, asking, "Will this really happen?" The system sent a message, "After seeing this, do you still not believe it?" After reading the message, Lloyd stood up abruptly. He hurriedly ran like a maniac. He ran down the palace corridor, thinking, he clearly said this would happen in the future. Lloyd recalled the scenes he saw in the future vision. He ran while thinking, I don't know how many there are, but it must be dealt with. The source of the locusts is already clear. Soon after, Lloyd reported to the Queen. She asked, "What, the whole of Cremona is filled with monsters?" Lloyd said, "Indeed, we must mobilize the army to prepare for the unprecedented chaos." The Queen said, "This is too sudden. Tell me more about this great disaster." Lloyd explained, "It's the enemy Asfahan. Their goal is to create a monster domino army and extract the power of the Magnetono Kingdom. By enslaving the beasts of the eastern wilderness, another group of monsters was pushed west by those moving east, and these monsters surged like dominoes, causing tremendous damage to the eastern region." After speaking, Lloyd thought, in this novel, for the next 3.5 years, or even longer, things that will happen on our distant northern land. He didn't know why time and details had changed, but now was not the time to argue about it. The Queen also pondered, it must be that Asfahan has taken action in the eastern wilderness. That is definitely possible. The Queen then called out to Lloyd, saying, "The news about Asfahan is very suspicious. How do you know about it?" Hearing the Queen's question, Lloyd stammered, "That matter." But thought to himself, "Damn it, think, use your brain." The Queen spoke, "Think about it, Lloyd has been hiding a lot from her. If Jim knew Asfahan's movements, why would Lloyd be even more suspicious?" At that moment, Lloyd began to stutter, licking his lips as he prepared to unleash his talkative genius, the king of boasting, a master of marketing prodigy, a language genius, the king of words, a psychological manipulator, a rational host, a trust destroyer. Lloyd began reporting, through some small contacts with relatives of the Iron Steel tribe from the eastern wilderness, they told me that something was happening in the west. What he first learned was about Kale's assassination plot. Kale and the mayor exchanged strange words and gazed at each other with tender eyes. Wow. Are those two on a date? Lloyd thought it was a beautiful scene, so he followed them and then witnessed it himself. The magical energy-absorbing object turned the surrounding area into a swamp. As the Queen knew, the guard Xavier was an unprecedented genius. Lloyd had been following him since he was a child, learning self-defense techniques. Through this genius, he also became a genius. So he was very skilled. After hearing this, the Queen narrowed her eyes and thought, almost everything makes sense. But she still felt, something feels a little off. The two were silent, not saying anything. The system notification activated the praise effect, earned Queen Alicia's absolute trust, with no conspiracy that would cause suspicions of treason. Lloyd also frowned, looking at the system panel. The Queen spoke, "All right. Jim's rapid response team, 500 heavy infantry, will provide 50 mages for support. Lloyd's task is to figure out the enemy's movements." After receiving the support, Lloyd smiled and thought, "Great, this person is really generous." He hurriedly said, "Thank you, Your Majesty." The Queen said, "Thank for what? If it's Lloyd, you should know best. Do you think you can guess something out of thin air without paying the price?" Lloyd said, "Of course, I know, there's nothing in this world that's free. If we can stop the monster's attack this time, then all predictions and decisions are the Queen's authority. I'm just helping to restore the royal power through the assassination case." The Queen smiled and said, "Lloyd is really suspicious, but she likes the way he speaks." Immediately, Lloyd and Xavier mounted their horses, cast magic, and set off. The two raced off. The horse was running too fast, causing Lloyd to open his mouth, and he couldn't be heard clearly. Xavier, riding alongside, said, "Lloyd must have a reason for doing this. Please explain slowly." Lloyd tried to speak, but the wind distorted his mouth, making it impossible to hear. Xavier said, "Yes, he understands. Tell him." The two didn't take the usual road but cut through the woods. Lloyd continued mumbling, and Xavier said again, when we reach the Frontera estate, we will arrive within 5 days, right, Lloyd? Lloyd thought while riding like a madman. Now Xavier could easily subdue an army from a small country. Watching dozens of men being cut down with a single sword, the enemy's morale would collapse quickly, but this time our enemies are not human, so there's no morale collapse. They just charge straight toward their prey, fearless of death, which is why having only Xavier isn't enough. Moreover, the attacks are coming from all directions, 360 degrees. This is not something that can be stopped by 1 or 2 people with strong firepower. Lloyd shouted to Podong, let's separate here, remember to be on time. After saying that, Podong jumped off his horse and went in the opposite direction. Lloyd continued to gallop, thinking, we already have a plan, just stick to it. The two rode their horses, leaping over the canyon. By the next morning, they had been riding non-stop the entire night. At that moment, Lloyd suddenly stopped his horse. Lloyd sat on his horse, observing the surroundings. In the distance, something like black clouds was moving across the sky. Lloyd frowned and thought, wait a little longer, just wait a bit more. The villagers working in the fields also looked up at the sky, sensing that something was wrong. A group of things, resembling black clouds, moved slowly across the sky. A person holding firewood looked up at the sky and said, what is that? Suddenly, Lloyd appeared on horseback, shouting, hey! What are you doing? Get out of here. The man was startled and turned around, saying, young master. Lloyd stretched out his hand and said, give me a lid, the biggest one. A swarm of locusts had already entered the Frontera territory. At the Baron's estate, the window was suddenly shattered, and the maid, Emily, screamed in fright. Looking back, it turned out that a locust had broken through the window and jumped inside. Emily, seeing the monstrous locust, didn't know what it was. When the locust rushed toward her, she raised her hand in fear and screamed. Suddenly, a figure appeared, wielding a chair. It was the Baroness. She struck the locust hard with the chair, killing it. But another batch of locusts rushed in from behind. The Baroness quickly grabbed Emily's hand and said, hurry, come with me. She ran while looking out the window, startled. The entire sky above the territory was covered by a swarm of locusts. She thought in terror, what on earth is going on? Suddenly, the Baron's voice came from the hallway, asking, Marbella, are you all right? He shouted, we must go out now. You two, gather with Byron. He hurriedly opened the door. But the outside was already filled with swarming locusts devouring everything. Upon seeing someone appear, the entire swarm of locusts fixed their red eyes on the prey. Over by Byron, he was running desperately. As he ran, he shouted, all guards, listen up. Gather at the Baron's mansion. While running, he suddenly heard a scream, ah! Get away! Looking over, he saw a person holding a shovel being surrounded by several locusts. He looked toward the estate and thought, oh no! The residents are in danger, but the Baron. At that moment, he recalled, previously, the Baron had smiled and said to him, I hope this doesn't happen. But if a disaster strikes my territory, please protect the people. I trust that the Lord and Knights exist for the benefit of the people. Byron rushed over and saved the young boy. Then he slashed and killed several locusts. He stood in front of the young boy and said, Michael, quickly hide behind me. But looking back, the number of locusts had already grown enormous. Haro Che was also crazily attacking the swarm of locusts. He opened his mouth and shouted loudly, Great Orc warriors! Even if today is the last day, we must honor our oath to our brothers and families. All over, people were fighting desperately. But the number of locusts was simply too large. All resistance was gradually being suppressed. Even the strong warrior Haro Che was overwhelmed by the sheer number of locusts. Now everyone is left with only despair. Fighting desperately in the midst of despair. The entire territory was covered by a massive swarm of locusts. It seemed that everyone had lost hope, with only waiting for death to arrive. But suddenly, a few locusts began to change. Their two antennae started to shake, then they looked elsewhere. Similar phenomena began to occur in other places. In the sky, the entire swarm of locusts began to fly away. The locust swarm at the Baron's estate stopped attacking and began flying toward other areas. The scene shifted to another place, and Lloyd shouted, "Damn grass-eaters." Xavier raised his sword beside him, and then struck hard at the pot lid in Lloyd's hand. Lloyd continued shouting, "Did you hear it? Hear that gentle sound? Does it make you more attractive?" Xavier continued swinging his sword and struck again. The two rode their horses at full speed, one holding the pot lid, the other constantly striking. At that moment, the entire swarm of locusts turned and began searching. They started changing their flight direction, flying toward the source of the loud sound. The entire swarm followed and flew toward another direction. The Baron and his wife heard the sound and said, "That sound, right? It must be Lloyd's voice." At this moment, all the locusts began chasing Lloyd and Xavier. Lloyd saw a swarm of locusts charging toward him and shouted, "It's terrifying. They're coming." Xavier turned around and said, "They're chasing us." Just as planned. Lloyd felt great after hearing Xavier's report. "Draw more in, push them to the outskirts." The two began running toward other areas, attracting more locusts. Lloyd shouted, "Xavier, strike hard." Xavier struck with great force, making a huge noise that nearly ruptured Lloyd's eardrums. Lloyd stuck his head out and asked, "Why was that strike so strong? But why does Xavier look so happy? Why is he laughing?" Xavier said, "One more." Lloyd thought while moving, just like it was written in the novel, those insects' reaction to the noise really worked. Lloyd shouted to Xavier, "Next we're going to the Marquis of Lacona's territory." Hearing Lloyd's words, Xavier was surprised and confused. Is Lloyd planning to help them even in such an emergency? System notification: Xavier's favorability towards you has increased by 3, earning you 54 RP. But Lloyd thought to himself, he's not going to be satisfied with that small amount, it's nowhere near enough to pay the water bill. The Marquis of Lacona's territory also suffered the same fate as Frontera's, with a swarm of locusts filling the sky. Lacona was running inside the mansion, screaming and holding his head. What is going on? He suddenly heard a sound beside him. At that moment, Xavier and Lloyd rode into the mansion, startling him. He looked up and just happened to see Lloyd arriving. Lloyd glared and said, "Don't even think about delaying the water tax." Lacona was stunned. Was he really going to ask for money at a time like this? Lloyd shouted, "Xavier, one more." Then the two immediately ran off, leaving Lacona still not understanding what had happened. Soon, a swarm of locusts flew over the mansion. Xavier asked Lloyd, "Is this the tactic of gathering them by walking through the buildings?" Lloyd answered, "Tactic? Bullshit." Lloyd's face became extremely fierce. "I'm just getting back at that damn Lacona. It feels so damn good." Looking at this face, Xavier thought, is this guy having another breakdown? Then, the two walked around, attracting more locusts. Lloyd shouted as they walked, "What's up, you guys, can you keep up with me? Captain Lloyd is here." Xavier shouted, "Lloyd, conserve your energy. What's the point of shouting all this?" Lloyd replied, "Xavier, you don't understand anything. I have to shout so everyone knows who saved them. Then I'll drain all the wealth in this territory." Xavier thought, this is insane. After circling Lacona's territory and attracting a huge swarm of locusts, Lloyd said, "That's enough. Let's head to the Merritt's reclamation area." But looking ahead, Lloyd was startled. Another swarm of locusts was charging toward them. Lloyd saw the pile of locusts and shouted, "Damn it! Another swarm." Xavier immediately urged his horse to the front, saying, "Put on the pot lid, follow me." Xavier immediately activated his swordmaster skill. With flashes of lightning like sword strikes, many locusts were split in two. Lloyd used the pot lid to block the locusts charging at them. Xavier swung his sword wildly, clearing the way for both of them. Suddenly, the locusts in front of them flew up and changed direction. Then they formed into a tight group and began attacking the locusts behind them. Seeing this, Lloyd said, "Great. They've formed into a group. A little more." Suddenly, the horse seemed a bit off. Lloyd looked at the horse and thought, is the horse tired? Damn. At that moment, Lloyd threw the pot lid and shouted, "Xavier, get ready to carry me. Xavier was surprised when he heard Lloyd's words, carry you. Lloyd grabbed a shovel, leaped off the horse, and jumped down. He then tightly hugged Xavier. Then he shouted, now Xavier is Lloyd's horse. Run. Xavier immediately jumped off the horse. After landing, he slid on the ground. Lloyd now shouted like he was urging a horse, hey, making Xavier furious. But now, even though he was angry, he had no choice but to endure it, clenching his teeth, sticking his butt out, and running. If the locusts caught up, they were both doomed. Xavier carried Lloyd and ran, moving as fast as lightning. But soon, the locust swarm was getting closer and closer. The two of them were gradually surrounded by the locusts. At this moment, two children popped out of the nearby river. The other two young men leaped up and jumped into the nearby waterway, covering their heads. Little Belle immediately flew up, facing the approaching swarm of locusts with its back turned. It let out a thunderous fart, spewing flames that covered a large area. The flying locusts were scorched by the fart's flames, and they could only scream, it stinks. It stinks. It smells so bad. The entire swarm of locusts was burned by the flames. Nearby villagers saw a huge pillar of fire and smoke rising into the sky. Lloyd quickly stood up from the waterway and shouted, second wave of attack. At this moment, Hippo had already climbed onto the embankment and began spraying water. The powerful water stream hit the locust swarm like a high-pressure water gun. Hippo continued spraying in other directions. When the water ran out, many of the locusts had been dispersed. Xavier and Lloyd immediately unleashed their ultimate move, the burst slash. The two of them released tremendous power, striking the remaining locusts. Wherever the two forces flew, they burned everything they encountered. Nearly all the locusts were killed, with only a few escaping. Their bodies fell like rain. The two stood there, panting, watching the locust rain. Lloyd lay on the ground and said, I'm exhausted. Xavier looked back and said, most of them should be taken care of. But there are still quite a few left, definitely over 1,000. Lloyd smiled while lying down and said, no problem, it's time to clean up the mess. At this moment, Papadong returned. It brought back 300 elite warriors from the elite tribe. At the same time, a cavalry squad had just arrived. That was 500 white warriors and 50 mages. Lloyd said, leave this mess to them, we have other things to deal with. Xavier asked, what is it? Lloyd said, the monster domino. One wave alone won't be enough to finish it. As soon as the white cavalry arrived, the captain immediately urged the horse and shouted, white cavalry. For the great prince. For the queen's territory. Eliminate all of them. Leave none alive. The cavalry immediately received support from the mages, enhancing their lance power. Then, they all charged forward. The remaining locusts were slain by the cavalry, some cut in half, others impaled on the lances, like skewered meat. On the other side, an orc warrior shouted and thrust a wooden stick forward. 3 locusts were instantly impaled and killed. The young orc walked over with the skewered locusts and started roasting them on a fire. The orcs around him raised their hands and shouted loudly. Once the meat was perfectly cooked, the young orc immediately grabbed a hot slice of meat. A group of orcs raised their hands and shouted even louder, meat. Protein. At this moment, the maid Emily walked over and called out to a young orc warrior. Sorry, orc warrior. She happily held a flower and walked up to him. She handed the flower to the young orc warrior and said, thank you for protecting me earlier. After giving the flower, she quickly ran off. The young orc held the flower petals, feeling deeply moved. From childhood to now, this was the first time a girl had given him a flower. The scene shifted to Lloyd, with the Duke and Duchess of Nan running anxiously, shouting, Lloyd. Are you okay? As soon as the Duke arrived, he grabbed Lloyd's shoulder and said, are you hurt? Lloyd, not used to such warm concern, stammered, I'm fine. The couple immediately embraced Lloyd tightly, saying, we are very grateful to you, and we apologize. You saved everyone from this terrible father. Why are you so willing to save people? What if you get hurt? Lloyd thought, not really, I'm preparing for retirement. I'm doing this for my own benefit. At that moment, the system sent a message and laughed. Lloyd asked, why are you laughing? The system sent a message, it seems you don't remember the last thing that was revealed? Lloyd asked, huh? What nonsense. What did I say? The system sent another message, well, forget it if you don't remember. Lloyd thought, it doesn't matter, there's more to do from now on. I have to prepare for the second wave. The system suddenly sent a message, notice, you have earned the new title Sexco Top Hunter. Controlled Selection Area, Nanduke Frontera Region and Lacona Marquis Region. Title Validity, 115 CP points. Title Effect, 2 title effects. Just a glance at this is enough to make all the monster insects feel fear. Those insects overwhelmed by fear will become extremely weak, and their combat power will drastically decrease. That night, Lloyd stood in the training field holding a staff. The captain of the White Cavalry walked over and said, Lloyd, what's the matter? Why did you call me over? This is the captain of the White Cavalry, Valardi Blanc. Lloyd bowed and said, thank you for responding. He played a crucial role in the locust clearing plan, so Lloyd expressed his gratitude and gave a respectful bow. Blanc frowned after hearing that and said, stop beating around the bush. It's clear to everyone that they were in charge of the clearing from the start. Lloyd smiled and said, no, that's not possible. If it were only us doing the clearing, it would have taken at least a few weeks. Thanks to them, we finished it in less than half a day. Blanc replied, actually, at first, he was quite angry. Lloyd is just an ordinary engineer, how could he command the Great White Cavalry? But when he arrived here, he realized that everything was carried out according to Lloyd's plan. He had to admit, Lloyd was an outstanding strategist. Saving the Queen may not have been a coincidence. However, his pride was still wounded. The mages had already left, but they still had to stay. They were trained to fight alongside the Queen, and they were destined to die here. He didn't particularly like Lloyd. After hearing Blanc's words, Lloyd fell into deep thought, remaining silent. Seeing Lloyd's silence, Blanc continued, he said what he wanted to say, now it's Lloyd's turn. What does Lloyd want from them? Lloyd began to recall the events from the novel, thinking, just as you imagined, he's not normal. In the novel, under the Mad Queen's orders, the White Cavalry captain carried out a ruthless purge. He had a life-and-death duel with Xavier, who tried to save the people. At that time, Xavier was not a swordmaster, so he almost couldn't defeat Blanc. Fortunately, Xavier eventually won. Blanc, on the verge of death, said, it's Xavier, right? If it's him, can you ask him for this privilege? Stop the Queen. Born a warrior, with only loyalty, sharp words, and directness. Lloyd smiled, thinking, there's no use in beating around the bush. The best approach was for Lloyd to smile and say to Blanc, would you like to have a match with me? If you win, you become my engineer corps. If you lose, you can return to the Queen immediately. Upon hearing Lloyd's words, Blanc became a bit angry and frowned. But soon, he smiled and said, Lloyd has seen through my thoughts. From the beginning, you never intended to accept my request. Do you want to challenge me? But there's one thing you overlooked. Do you think I, the Queen's shield, would fight civilians without orders? Lloyd gave a half-squinting look and said, indeed, that's what you overlooked. You've already received command from the Queen. That is an order. Blanc, hearing Lloyd's provocation, gritted his teeth in anger, glaring at him. Lloyd seemed unfazed and continued, though this is an order, fighting with a shovel is a disgrace to a knight's honor. Wouldn't it be more glorious to win in a fair and righteous way? Blanc immediately drew his sword and said, Lloyd, do you have a weapon? Lloyd just smiled and raised the shovel in his hand. Blanc stepped forward with his sword and said, I heard Lloyd punished the traitors of the territory with that shovel, that's fine. Anyway, you'll be the first to strike. Lloyd thought to himself, not bad, you've bitten. Now, the chances of winning are 0%. Lloyd has 3 levels of circles, but that power is useless. Blanc is a swordsmanship genius and almost killed Xavier. There's no way to compare him. But as usual, he has a powerful weapon. Blanc immediately said, because this is a battle between a knight and an ordinary person, the rules must be slightly different. If he hesitates even a little in Lloyd's attack, Lloyd will win. After hearing Blank's words, Lloyd immediately flashed an angelic smile from Ping Yang and said, "Form the sword." The tip of Lloyd's shovel also started to glow. Blanc saw Lloyd's reaction and suddenly realized, damn, something feels off. Lloyd immediately used the skill explosion slash and swung it forward. Blanc saw the power coming and immediately dropped his sword, leaping aside. If he didn't dodge this attack, he would suffer greatly. Lloyd's attack surged like lightning toward the distant peak. As soon as it hit the mountaintop, a huge explosion echoed. Blanc watched the mountaintop being blown away, his eyes wide, mouth agape, terrified. Damn, is he really going to do this? If I hadn't dodged, I'd already be playing with my ancestors. To go home and see them, I'd have to wait until the 1st or 15th of the month, and only come back to stay longer in July. He stood up and looked toward the mountaintop covered in dust and smoke. Then he turned around and looked at Lloyd, still with a look of horror on his face. Damn, is this real? After using the skill, Lloyd collapsed to the ground, his body trembling. But he still struggled to lift his head, showing a holy smile at Blanc. I won, you know? The 500 strongest White Knights have been transferred to the Frontera Estates Engineer Corps. One soldier was very dissatisfied, threw his shovel, and shouted loudly, "Brother." He walked up to Blanc and said, "Although Lloyd was given the authority to command us, this is not acceptable. We've devoted our lives to the battlefield, and now we're being forced to do this heavy labor?" Hearing the soldier's dissatisfaction, Blanc sighed and said, "This is not just because of the order." After hearing Blanc's words, the soldier was also surprised. Blanc recalled the night of the duel when Lloyd pointed at him and said, "I'll show him something else amazing. That shovel is even stronger than swordsmanship." He started to continue digging the soil, saying as he dug, "You have something to verify, so please cooperate." The scene shifted to Lloyd and Xavier. The two young men arrived in a vast place, a forest stretching to the mountains in the distance. Xavier turned his head and asked Lloyd, "Does this really work?" Lloyd replied, "The orc tribe from the wilderness taught me this method, and it's really reliable. They've tested it and succeeded. Just wait and see. It will protect Lloyd's honey jar." A large crowd had already gathered below, and they were pulling up ropes, carving out the head of a huge and fierce monster. The scene shifts to another day. Inside a house in the territory, everything was shaking violently. The tremors grew stronger, and everything began to sway and collapse. The villagers could only panic and huddle together. Everyone in the manor felt terrified, but at the same time, everyone shared a common thought: Lloyd will protect us. Lloyd climbed onto a high rock, gazing into the distance, where dust was rising. He held two flags, green and white in color, in his hands. Blanc and the cavalry were on one side of the manor, looking at the dusty area. Seeing this, he thought, "I had my doubts from the beginning. But, it's really here." A group of monsters was charging toward the manor. It was a group of mammoths. Back to an earlier time, Lloyd and Blanc were talking. Blanc asked, "Is it the mammoths this time?" "Lloyd, do you have evidence?" Lloyd replied, "What does he mean by evidence?" At that moment, Lloyd put on an iron mask to guide his rationality and manipulate Blanc's mind. Lloyd appeared self-assured, and Blanc asked, "Self-assured?" Lloyd responded, "Exactly." Blanc said, "No, he means." Back to the present, Blanc was deep in thought. Lloyd really is good at lying. However, the final prediction was correct. Therefore, it's better to prepare for battle than to doubt anything. Advance at the same speed as the front of the mammoth herd, then defeat the leader. Then quickly surround the stationary mammoths and attack from the outside, like peeling away a shell. Isn't 10 enough? We might lose 20. While deep in thought, suddenly a soldier shouted from behind, "After this battle, I will propose to my lover back home." Another soldier turned around and said, "Huh? What are you talking about? Don't say such nonsense." The soldier responded, "Why not?" Blanc pondered deeply. Instead of preparing a ring for his lover, he should feel honored for his spear. Perhaps that's the only thing he can bring back. Nothing to fear, the life of a warrior will give us determination, and we need it right now. Blanc began to urge his horse, then shouted, "White Knights, move out. Before he finished speaking, someone shouted, "Wait." It turned out to be Byron walking over to stop them. Blanc asked, "Mr. Byron, why aren't you wearing armor?" Byron answered, "Lloyd said I don't need it." Blanc asked again, "What happened before?" Byron said, "He probably can't explain it. But there must be a good reason. He came here to give Blanc a signal." Blanc didn't understand what that signal was. Byron said, "Blanc, do you see the person on that white rock?" Blanc replied, "I see him, I can see." Byron said, "Soon, Lloyd will give the signal." Lloyd began to raise the flag and wave it to signal. Over here, Byron raised his hand, looked, and read aloud, "The White Knights move southeast. Outside the village, move quickly." After hearing the command, Blanc shouted, "This is nonsense. Isn't this just opening a path for the monsters? It's only a matter of time before those monsters break through the wall. Does Lloyd think attacking from the side will be effective? Attacking from the side is useless against them." Over here, Lloyd continued waving the flag to signal. Byron kept reading aloud, "Repeat after me. For Her Majesty the Queen, forward." Hearing this, Blanc became even angrier. "What was that? Are you kidding me?" Byron replied, "No, everything was planned in advance." Blanc looked at Lloyd waving the flag on the rock, thinking, "What is Lloyd thinking? This makes no sense." At this moment, the herd of mammoths was charging madly toward the manor. Lloyd held the flag, continuing to signal, notifying everyone, "They're coming." The herd of mammoths continued charging forward, showing no signs of slowing down. Lloyd stood on the rock, watching the herd of mammoths charge past. He smiled, thinking, the first step of the plan. As the herd of mammoths charged forward, a figure of a monster suddenly appeared in front. They suddenly stopped abruptly. This caused the entire herd to tumble to the ground. The natural enemy of the mammoths is the giant lizard. It blocked the path ahead, stopping suddenly, causing the herd behind to crash into each other. The second step of the plan. Lloyd waved the flag again. Byron shouted, "White Knights, charge! Harder! Create a thick fog! Strike with spears, make it louder!" Blanc watched all of this, anxiously thinking, "Clearly, they are acting according to the plan, but what is this?" The tusked elephants began to panic after hearing the loud sound. They were frantic, desperately searching for a way to escape. Lloyd stood observing, thinking, the tusked elephants are afraid of giant lizards. The huge sound of hooves makes them think there are many giant lizards approaching. The tusked elephants began to scream and turned to run. Then, they started moving south. Blanc also saw the direction the tusked elephants were running and thought, "They're moving. Wait, that direction is. The trench we dug was to save the giant lizards." He asked himself, "Why did we dig it so deep?" The tusked elephants were charging loudly toward the trench. This was the third step of the plan. When they reached here, they would start falling below. Lloyd immediately waved the flag to signal. The hippopotamus suddenly appeared. Lloyd immediately shouted, "Hippo! Move immediately! Reverse the water flow!" The hippopotamus opened its mouth and sprayed water. The tusked elephants in the trench were swept away by the water flow. Lloyd then lowered both flags. He spread his arms, celebrating the success like the Titanic. Everyone was surprised, stunned, because we had won. The tusked elephants were pushed along the trench by the water sprayed by the hippopotamus, flowing to a place connected to the river. When they reached a calmer section of the water, they began to climb up the riverbed to the shore. Blanc stood elsewhere, watching everything that was happening below. He thought, "We won without fighting." Suddenly, Lloyd sat beside him and said, "There's plenty of food here, no need to go back for the giant lizards. Now we have a water channel. I'm grateful to them." Blanc frowned and asked, "Was using this water channel part of your plan, Lloyd?" Lloyd smiled and said, "Not really part of the plan. After we dug it, I thought we could use it." Blanc fell into thought after hearing Lloyd's words and didn't say anything more. He began to recall the past. In every battle, at least 5 members lost their lives. The blood-stained spears were sent back to the soldiers' families. Her father sacrificed himself for the homeland, for the people. He died in honor. Our cavalry and the kingdom of Magentano will always remember the bravery of Knight Durando. When the families heard the news of their loved ones' deaths, they collapsed. After every battle, all that was left were the painful cries of loved ones, those who died on the battlefield. The graves kept increasing. Although these comrades were used to life and death, they still felt sorrow when losing a companion. Bronk saw all of this and could only shout loudly, "How much more time are they going to waste? Start training." But on the contrary, he was the one in the most pain. In the heavy rain, he watched his comrades who had fought alongside him, now lying quietly. Bravery. Honor. These were the words he read every time he lost a member. It was absurd. Deep down, he knew, what death leaves behind is not honor. After that person died, all that was left was the hellish years of waiting for their loved ones. Back to reality, the knights raised their spears and cheered for victory. Everyone was happy. One person walked over, hugged a comrade, and said, "Kid, remember to invite me to your wedding." He replied, "Of course." Bronk stood there, lost in thought, watching the joy of everyone. At that moment, Xavier and Lloyd walked over. Xavier asked, "Does this mean the tide of these monsters will continue endlessly?" Lloyd said, "Yes, it will end, but we still have to go through several more attacks." Xavier then said, "Every time we do this, the losses to the manor are immense." After hearing this, Lloyd pointed to his head and said, "Oh, Xavier's IQ has improved quite a bit." Lloyd asked, "Xavier, want to guess what I'm thinking right now?" Xavier said flatly, "Of course. We're planning to stop the monster invasion with the least amount of labor." Lloyd said, "Exactly. And the plan is?" Xavier interrupted, "I know Lloyd has already prepared the plan." At this moment, Bronk walked over and said, "In this plan, their white knights will also provide assistance." Lloyd, surprised, glanced at him and said, "What? Isn't he planning to return to the royal road?" Bronk explained, "He is considering writing a request letter to His Highness." Today, he saw what real victory is. At the same time, he realized he is an incompetent commander. Bronk then shrugged off his cloak. Then he knelt down and said, "Allow him to observe Lloyd's wisdom." Xavier thought, "Hey, brother, you're wrong." "What wisdom? If you were here, you'd be corrupted by this young man Lloyd sooner or later." All the knights knelt down, following their leader, waiting for Lloyd's approval. Lloyd pondered for a moment, silently, then spoke. "I have been waiting for him to say that." Lloyd smiled and said, "This operation would not have been possible without the White Knights." That evening, the important figures of the manor gathered for a rectangular table meeting. Lloyd spoke first, "Baron Nam, do you remember when I proposed constructing an aqueduct from Lake Capua, and you strongly opposed it?" Baron Nam replied, "Oh, I remember. There is a legendary monster in Lake Capua, named King Storma, and it is currently asleep." However, with the stimulation of the water source, Lloyd forced the construction to proceed, claiming it would never wake up. Lloyd said, "Yes, that's true, but this time, Lloyd will awaken it." After hearing this, Baron Nam was stunned for a moment, then shouted, "What?" Baroness Nam anxiously said, "I completely oppose it." Knight Bronk raised his hand and said, "I agree." At this point, Xavier also said, "I agree." The Baron glared at Xavier and angrily shouted, "Xavier, you are a guard knight. You should oppose this." Xavier helplessly replied, "Sorry, but even so, you cannot defeat it." Lloyd glanced at him and said, "Xavier's IQ has improved quite a bit." At this point, Lloyd raised his hand and shouted, "Let's start construction according to the democratic process." The Baron yelled from the side, "Democracy? What is this?" "No, Lloyd. Wait." The next day, Lloyd, Xavier, Bronk, and the knights left with all their equipment. Xavier asked, "Lloyd, do you really want to awaken King Storma and control it?" Lloyd, looking confused, said, "I'm not a magician, how could I do that? I have researched a lot of materials, legends, and its habits. I've learned a lot. In the reference materials, it is described as a giant magical monster as large as a mountain. Surprisingly, there are no stories of it attacking humans. However, the lake it built is a dam. In other words, if its lair is destroyed, it will shout and repair it. So we will destroy part of the lake, every morning and evening. Every time it recovers, we continue. The monsters crossing from the eastern mountains will be scared. This is the so-called front gate watchdog strategy. After hearing Lloyd's explanation, Xavier frowned, thinking, this is a story about defeating a sleeping monster, even Satan would scream. Xavier hurriedly asked, what if the calculations are wrong? What if they attack us? Lloyd retorted, why is Xavier asking such an obvious question? You are a knight. You must defeat it. Then, as expected, Xavier loudly shouted every morning and evening, executing the front gate watchdog strategy. After hearing Lloyd's words, Xavier continued to frown, thinking, is Lloyd asking me to guard the gate like a dog?